Welcome to True Crime for Sleeping. Here we explore the most haunting cases in a calm and measured way, perfect for listening as you drift into rest. If you find these stories engaging, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and letting us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let us take you back to a cold night in 1980. The lights of the high school gymnasium glowed softly against the darkness of the surrounding fields. It was November 9th, 1979, in Brooksville, Florida, and a faint chill hung in the air that made breath visible under the stadium lamps. Inside, the homecoming dance was winding down. A slow song played, and groups of teenagers huddled together in pairs and clusters, some laughing, some stealing glances at the clock, others counting the minutes before curfews called them home. Tammy Jo Alexander was among them. 16 years old, petite, with wide brown eyes that seemed to carry more maturity than her age should have allowed. She wasn't one to dominate a room, but she had a quiet charm. Her friends would later say she was the sort of person who noticed if someone was sitting alone, the sort who would go sit beside them and start a conversation without making it seem like pity. Her life, however, wasn't without turbulence. Tammy had been living with a friend's family for several months. Her home life with her mother had been complicated, strained by arguments and emotional distance. She had run away before, and those who knew her understood that she had a tendency to disappear for a day or two without warning. But she always came back. She was adventurous, but not reckless, or at least not usually. That night at the dance, something shifted. Witnesses would later remember seeing her slip out before the last song. No one could quite agree on the exact time, but somewhere between 9:30 and 10 p.m., she left the building alone. Outside, the parking lot was half empty. Cars idled, parents waiting for their children. A few students lingered near the entrance, jackets pulled tight against the cool breeze. Tammy was seen walking toward the road, her dress hem brushing against her knees, a thin cardigan draped over her shoulders. Some thought she might be heading home, others assumed she was going to meet a friend. She was never seen in Brooksville again. In the following days, the absence didn't cause immediate panic. People in town had grown accustomed to Tammy's occasional disappearances, but as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, unease began to spread. Her friends heard nothing. Her foster family couldn't reach her. Even her mother, who had often struggled to connect with her, admitted she had no idea where Tammy might be. Some thought she might have traveled north, maybe to see relatives, maybe to start over somewhere new. Others speculated that she had hitchhiked away, drawn by the promise of something different, something bigger than small-town Florida could offer. But deep down, even the most optimistic among them felt the chill of something darker. On the morning of November 10th, 1979, more than 1,000 miles away in Caledonia, New York, a farmer heading out to tend to his fields noticed something strange in the frosty grass beside the road. The sun was barely above the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. At first he thought it was a mannequin, an odd sight, but not impossible. Teenagers sometimes played pranks, and things fell from passing trucks all the time. But as he approached, the truth became grimly apparent. It was the body of a young woman. She lay on her side, her clothes neat, though her coat was missing. A thin layer of frost had settled over her hair. There was no identification, no purse, nothing that told police who she was or why she was there. The only things she had with her were the clothes she wore, a plaid shirt, jeans and sneakers, and a small amount of cash in her pocket. An autopsy revealed she had been shot twice, once in the head, once in the back. The wounds were clean, the work of someone who either knew how to handle a firearm or had done this before. There were no signs of sexual assault, no clear motive. The case was immediately labeled a homicide, but without identification, she became known only as the Caledonia Jane Doe. Investigators scoured missing persons reports across the state and neighboring regions, but nothing matched. The girl's features, estimated age, and clothing didn't align neatly with any ongoing searches. For decades, her face appeared on police bulletins, cold case flyers, and later, online databases dedicated to the missing and unidentified. Artists created reconstructions, trying to imagine what she might have looked like in life. In each rendering, there was something haunting in her expression, as though she was asking wordlessly to be remembered. In Brooksville, life moved on. Tammy's case faded from active investigation. Without clear evidence of foul play, and with her history of running away, authorities quietly categorized her as a possible runaway who might resurface at any time. There were no known connections between her disappearance in Florida and the body found in New York. The two cases existed in entirely separate worlds, one an unconfirmed runaway, the other a nameless murder victim in a distant state. Yet for those who had known Tammy, the years without contact gnawed at them. They didn't believe she would vanish entirely without word. Some feared she had met with danger shortly after leaving the dance. Others clung to hope that she had simply chosen a new life somewhere far away. What no one realized at the time was that these two mysteries, Tammy's disappearance and the Caledonia Jane Doe, were in fact the same story. But it would take more than 3 decades, countless technological advances, and a relentless push from cold case investigators to finally connect the dots. By the early 2000s, DNA technology had transformed the way law enforcement handled cold cases. Unsolved murders that had sat dormant for decades were being re-examined with fresh tools. In New York, the Caledonia Jane Doe case was assigned to a new generation of investigators who were determined not to let the girl's memory fade away. They collected DNA from her remains and entered it into national databases. At the same time, in Florida, missing persons records were being digitized, making it easier to compare across state lines. This was a slow, painstaking process, but the pieces were being put in place for the connection to be made. The problem was that Tammy's case was thin on official records. Much of the early paperwork had been lost or incomplete, and her status as a runaway meant her file hadn't been prioritized. It wasn't until a determined investigator began digging through old archives, matching dates and descriptions, that the first glimmers of recognition emerged. In the years that followed, DNA would do what witnesses, police and circumstance had failed to do for decades: bring Tammy home, at least in name. But that was only half the story. Knowing her identity would be one thing. Uncovering who had taken her life, and why, would be something else entirely. The weeks after Tammy left the homecoming dance passed in a slow, uneasy blur. In Brooksville, people noticed her absence, but not with the urgency reserved for cases where someone had been taken violently, or was known to be in immediate danger. Her tendency to leave for days or even weeks had become part of her story. She was 16, restless, often at odds with authority, and pulled by the invisible current that drives some teenagers to believe they must find something bigger than the world they were born into. But underneath that, there was a pattern that her closest friends recognized, even if they didn't fully articulate it at the time. Tammy's disappearances were impulsive, but not directionless. She always seemed to have somewhere in mind, someone to meet, some temporary landing place. That winter, however, there were no phone calls, no letters, no whispered rumors about someone having seen her in Tampa, Miami, or any of the other cities she had once hinted about visiting. Her foster family reported her missing again, though the tone of the report was weary, as if repeating a process they knew would go nowhere. The sheriff's office took the information, filed the paperwork, and added her to a list of runaways. The deputies were polite but not overly concerned. Runaways came back when they were ready, they said. Most did. Her biological mother, Barbara, was quieter in her response. She had her own struggles, and though there was an ache somewhere deep inside her over Tammy's absence, she carried it the way one carries an old wound, protecting it by not looking too closely. She told herself that if Tammy had chosen to leave, she would come back when she was ready. What no one knew was that in the days after the dance, Tammy had somehow made her way out of Florida entirely. Whether she had planned it beforehand or seized an opportunity in the moment was unclear. She may have met someone offering her a ride, or perhaps she had friends willing to take her part of the way. The details were a blank space, a missing stretch of film between the last image of her walking away from the school and the unthinkable reality of where she would be found. In 1979, hitchhiking was still common among young people, despite the risks. Strangers offering rides were not automatically viewed with suspicion, and the idea of traveling long distances in the passenger seat of a truck or car was to some a symbol of freedom. But for others, it became the first step into something far more dangerous. Tammy's journey north was never officially mapped. There were no confirmed sightings, no recorded phone calls, and no receipts or letters that could anchor her movements in time. But someone, or several someones must have crossed her path in those hours or days. Someone must have known where she was going, even if they did not know her name. By November 10th, she had traveled over 1,000 miles. That meant either a single driver making the long trip, a series of short rides that carried her across state lines, or possibly travel by bus or another form of public transportation. Each possibility introduced dozens, even hundreds of potential witnesses, and yet not one of them came forward when her murder was first made public. In New York, the discovery of her body shook the quiet farming community of Caledonia. People were not accustomed to violent crime in their midst, and certainly not the kind that left a young girl dead by the side of a rural road. Sheriff's deputies and state police canvassed the area, knocking on doors, speaking to truckers, stopping cars to ask if anyone had seen a girl matching her description in the days before. The responses were polite but empty. A few residents thought they might have seen a teenager walking along the road earlier in the week, but their memories were hazy, the details interchangeable with any other stranger who might have passed through. Rural life meant that new faces were often just travelers, here for a day, then gone. The autopsy provided clues, though none led to an identity. She was healthy, well-nourished, and had no signs of long-term neglect. The plaid shirt and jeans she wore were common, but investigators noted that her clothing seemed clean and relatively new. Her teeth were in good condition, and her hair appeared recently trimmed. These small details suggested that she had not been living on the street for long, if at all. The manner of death was swift and deliberate. 2 shots. No defensive wounds, no prolonged struggle. Whoever killed her had either caught her by surprise, or held her in such a way that resistance was impossible. There were no signs of robbery beyond the absence of her coat, which could have been removed to mislead investigators about the time of death, or simply discarded for reasons known only to the killer. In Brooksville, the winter holidays came and went. For many, Tammy's absence faded into background memory. Teenagers graduated, left town, started families. The space she had once occupied in their lives was filled with other faces and other stories. But for the few who had truly cared for her, there was always a quiet, unanswered question. Over the years, fragments of rumor emerged. A girl in Tampa claimed she'd seen Tammy at a bus station sometime after the dance. Someone else said she might have been spotted in Georgia, but none of these accounts were solid enough to reopen the case in earnest. The runaway label hung over her file like a locked door. Meanwhile, the Jane Doe in Caledonia was buried under a simple headstone. The local community, moved by the tragedy, raised funds for her burial. Flowers would occasionally appear at the grave, placed there by strangers who had never known her in life, but could not bear the thought of her being forgotten in death. Years passed, then decades. In the absence of modern forensic tools, both cases lived separate, incomplete lives in the records of 2 different states. The missing girl in Florida remained a name on a paper list. The murdered girl in New York remained a face without a name, and the distance between them, physical and bureaucratic, was enough to keep the truth hidden. It would take an entirely new approach, driven by technology and persistence, to finally bridge that gap. But for now, in the early 1980s and 1990s, Tammy Jo Alexander existed only as a memory to a shrinking number of people in Florida, and as an anonymous tragedy to a quiet town in New York. And somewhere the person who had taken her life walked free, carrying the weight of a secret no one had yet learned to uncover. In the days following the discovery of the young girl's body in Caledonia, Livingston County law enforcement worked with urgency, but also with the limitations of their time. The case was already unusual for them. Homicides in that rural stretch of western New York were rare, and those involving someone so young and unidentified were even rarer. The first step was to document everything: the scene, the clothing, the tire marks in the gravel shoulder, the distances between the body and the road. Investigators measured and photographed everything meticulously, their boots crunching in the frosted grass, while the November wind swept across the fields. There were no signs of a prolonged fight. The ground bore no deep impressions of struggling feet, no scatter of personal items suggesting she had tried to flee. Her position was calm, almost posed, a detail that some officers noted quietly among themselves, but did not put in the initial reports. The surrounding farmland was wide open, dotted with barns, silos, and lines of bare trees marking property boundaries. Neighbors were cooperative, but their stories varied. One man thought he'd heard a vehicle late in the night, a truck, maybe, but could not be certain if it had stopped, or simply slowed as it passed. Another said she had seen headlights near the intersection around 3 a.m., though she could not tell if the vehicle had been parked or turning. None of it was solid. In 1979, technology was not on their side. There were no surveillance cameras on rural roads, no databases of license plates, and no quick way to compare missing person reports across the country. They sent out bulletins to surrounding counties and to state police across New York, describing the girl and her clothing in painstaking detail. The description was simple but vivid: approximately 5'3" in height, slim build, light brown hair with a reddish tint, hazel eyes and freckles. She wore a distinctive plaid shirt over a turtleneck, blue jeans and brown boots. No jewelry, no purse, no coat. Her fingernails were neatly trimmed, and her overall appearance suggested she had been cared for until recently. They also sent the case information to the FBI, in hopes of matching her to missing person reports from other states. But in those years, interstate cooperation was slow and cumbersome. There were no instant alerts. Instead, information traveled by teletype and mail. The case of the murdered girl in Caledonia would be recorded in filing cabinets and on index cards, waiting for the right eyes to connect it with another set of records hundreds of miles away. Local investigators kept at it. They visited motels in nearby towns, asking if anyone had checked in with a young girl matching her description. They stopped at diners, gas stations and bus depots. They showed her photograph to waitresses, clerks and truck drivers. Occasionally, someone thought she looked familiar, but the memory was always just out of reach. A vague sense that she might have passed through days or weeks earlier, never strong enough to turn into a lead. The autopsy deepened the mystery. The coroner noted that her stomach contained partially digested food, possibly a hamburger and fries, the kind you might get from a roadside diner. This suggested she had eaten shortly before her death. Investigators began looking for diners along the major routes into Caledonia, where someone might have seen her. But none of the employees they questioned could recall a girl matching her description from the night before. There were no drugs or alcohol in her system, no evidence of prolonged abuse. The 2 gunshot wounds were precise, one to the back of the head, another to the front, suggesting an execution-style killing rather than a chaotic spur-of-the-moment attack. The weapon was believed to be a .38 caliber revolver, though no shell casings were found at the scene, consistent with that type of gun. The lack of identification was maddening. Normally, even when a body turned up without a wallet or ID, there were small personal touches, a note, a bus ticket, something with a name, but she had nothing. Even the labels on her clothing were generic, or had been removed, leaving no brand or store that could be traced. The press began covering the story. Headlines referred to her simply as Caledonia Jane Doe, and local residents took a deep interest in the case. Churches held prayer services, and a local florist offered to donate flowers for her burial if she remained unidentified. People brought in photographs of missing relatives, though most were quickly ruled out. One family from Pennsylvania drove up after hearing about the case, convinced the girl might be their runaway daughter. They sat with the sheriff, examined the photographs, and listened to the details. In the end, the match wasn't right. They drove home with the same hollow uncertainty they had arrived with, their own mystery unsolved. After the initial burst of activity, the case began to slow. Detectives kept working it, but without new information, it became harder to justify dedicating full-time resources to a case with no clear suspect, no vehicle description, and no name for the victim. The hope was that somewhere, a missing persons report would come across their desk that matched her exactly. But weeks turned into months, and that never happened. In Florida, Tammy Jo Alexander's name remained on the runaway list. There was no note in her file to suggest she might be connected to a murder hundreds of miles away. Her foster family assumed she had simply vanished into a life of her choosing. Her friends, those who remembered her well, spoke of her less and less. Time worked to dull the urgency. By spring of 1980, the case in Caledonia had become a quiet but persistent presence in the sheriff's office. a file always sitting somewhere nearby, waiting for a break. The deputies would sometimes talk about it in the evenings, swapping theories in low voices. Some believed she had been killed by someone she was traveling with, perhaps an older man posing as a protector. Others thought she might have been picked up while hitchhiking and murdered by a stranger. A few even suspected she might have been targeted for reasons they could not yet see, a connection to something larger, something that had reached her all the way from wherever she came from. But without her name, they were chasing a shadow. And so, Caledonia Jane Doe was laid to rest in a small cemetery, under a simple stone engraved with the date she was found, and the words, "Loving daughter and granddaughter." The inscription was chosen by the community, a way of granting her the dignity she had been denied in death. It was a gesture meant to comfort, but it also marked the beginning of decades of silence. Her grave would stand as a question no one could answer, a question whose solution was sitting, unseen, in another state's cold files. Only much later would those two stories, the runaway in Florida and the Jane Doe in New York, finally collide, rewriting everything that had been assumed for more than 30 years. As the seasons passed, the mystery of the girl found in Caledonia began to settle into the fabric of the community. People who lived nearby continued to remember that cold November morning, the flashing lights on the roadside, and the whispered speculation in diners and grocery store aisles. But for the sheriff's office, it became one case among many, still important, still unsolved, but without the momentum of those first frantic weeks. Detective John York, who had been among the first on the scene, carried the weight of the case with him. In those early months, he would revisit the file regularly, almost ritualistically. He'd flip through the photographs, the autopsy report, the witness statements. He'd trace the maps of the area, staring at the small red circle where her body had been found. He knew that without a name, the odds of solving her murder were slim. But there was always the chance, a phone call from another jurisdiction, a tip from a passerby, who suddenly remembered something, a missing persons report that matched her exactly. In Florida, the story of Tammy Jo Alexander faded more quietly, but no less tragically. Her absence was not met with coordinated searches or news coverage. To those who had known her in Brooksville, her disappearance was folded into a narrative that was easy to accept, that she had simply run away and didn't want to be found. It was the late 1970s, a time when runaway teens were often written off as having chosen a new life. The possibility that something terrible might have happened to her was either not considered, or it was too painful for some to dwell on. This disconnect between the two states, between the murder in rural New York and the runaway in small-town Florida, would persist for decades. In those years, law enforcement agencies across the country worked largely in isolation. Missing person cases and unidentified bodies were often handled within county lines, sometimes extending to the state level. But without a centralized, easily searchable system, connecting a teenager from one state to a body found in another was like trying to match two puzzle pieces, kept in different rooms. Throughout the 1980s, occasional developments in the Caledonia case would briefly reignite interest. In 1981, a young woman in Pennsylvania was arrested for hitchhiking, and at first glance, she bore a resemblance to the composite drawing of Caledonia Jane Doe. Detectives traveled to confirm, only to find it was not their victim. In 1984, a man arrested on unrelated charges in New York confessed to killing a girl by the roadside years earlier, but he quickly recanted, and investigators determined he had been in prison at the time of the Caledonia murder. There were tips about truck drivers, drifters, and traveling carnival workers. One caller claimed the girl might have been part of a group of runaways moving between states, a shadowy circuit of teenagers relying on strangers for rides and shelter. But each lead collapsed under scrutiny. The truth was, without knowing who she was, detectives could only guess at her circumstances in the hours and days before her death. Meanwhile, her grave in Caledonia became a quiet landmark. Visitors left flowers, small stuffed animals, and handwritten notes. Some came because they had seen her case in the newspaper. Others came because they had lost someone themselves and understood the ache of not knowing. The cemetery caretaker noticed that certain tokens, a faded rose,
a ribbon tied to the headstone, would appear without explanation, as if someone out there still felt a connection to her, even if they didn't know her name. In Florida, Tammy's absence became part of the landscape of memory for the few who remembered her well. A classmate might think of her when passing the schoolyard, or when hearing a certain song on the radio. But without answers, she became a ghost in their personal histories, a girl frozen in time, still wearing the plaid shirts and jeans she had favored. The people who might have pushed harder for answers were few, and the years dulled even those questions. By the early 1990s, the case in Caledonia had been officially classified as cold. The file sat among dozens of others in a cabinet in the sheriff's office, its pages growing brittle with time. Advances in forensic science were beginning to emerge. DNA testing was slowly becoming more available, but in those early years, the process was costly, and often reserved for cases with strong suspect leads. The unidentified girl from Caledonia was not yet considered a candidate. Still, every few years, detectives would revisit her case. A new sheriff might assign a fresh set of eyes, hoping that a detail overlooked before might stand out. They would drive back to the scene, stand in the same stretch of road where she had been found, and try to picture that night in 1979, the quiet, the frost on the fields, the sound of a car door opening and closing. But the trail remained cold. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was founded in 1984, and in time they began collecting information on unidentified victims, as well as missing children. But the process of adding older cases was slow. The Caledonia girls' details were eventually entered into their files, though the reach of that database was limited in those early years. It was progress, but not enough to close the gap between Florida and New York. In the mid-1990s, technology brought a glimmer of new hope. Composite images could be refined with computer assistance, creating more lifelike renderings of unidentified victims. The Caledonia girl's drawing was updated, her hair color adjusted, the tilt of her chin softened. It was sent to newspapers and posted in a handful of public spaces. A few calls came in, but none panned out. Through it all, Detective York never stopped thinking about her. Even when other cases demanded his time, he carried the image of that frost-covered roadside in his mind. He believed that somewhere, someone had the missing piece. It might be a family who had lost contact with a runaway daughter. It might be a friend who remembered her mentioning New York before disappearing. Or it might be a stranger who had given her a ride that final night, a ride that ended far too soon. The tragedy was that those answers were already out there, just not in the same place at the same time. In Brooksville, Florida, a dusty file labeled Tammy Jo Alexander contained the story of a missing teenager whose disappearance was never solved. In Caledonia, New York, a file labeled Unidentified Female, November 10th, 1979, held the details of a murder victim whose identity was never known, and for more than 30 years, those two files would remain separate, silently waiting for the day they would finally be joined.
By the early 2000s, the world had shifted in ways that would have been unimaginable when Tammy Jo disappeared in 1979. The internet was no longer a novelty. It was becoming a central part of daily life. For law enforcement, it offered both new challenges and new possibilities. Information could be shared across state lines instantly, and databases could be accessed by agencies hundreds of miles apart. More importantly, it allowed members of the public, ordinary people with no official ties to law enforcement, to get involved in cold cases in a way that had never happened before. Websites dedicated to missing persons and unidentified victims began appearing, run by volunteers who gathered photos, case files, and timelines. Some of these amateur investigators had lost loved ones themselves. Others were drawn by a deep sense of empathy and curiosity. They pored over decades-old police reports, compared missing persons to unidentified bodies, and shared their findings in online forums. The Caledonia Jane Doe case became one of those that caught the attention of the online community. Her case had elements that resonated with people: the innocence of youth, the senseless violence, the haunting image of a girl found alone in a cold field. The fact that she had been found wearing distinctive clothing, a men's red plaid shirt, jeans and brown hiking boots, gave searchers something specific to latch onto. Volunteers began combing through old missing persons listings, looking for teenage girls reported missing in the late 1970s who matched her description. In Livingston County, Detective John York, now older, with decades of service behind him, found himself cautiously hopeful as these online communities grew. He had always believed that public awareness was key, but traditional media could only do so much. The internet, however, could keep her story alive indefinitely. Still, he was careful not to get too swept up in optimism. For every promising lead that surfaced, there were dozens that led nowhere. Across the country in Florida, Tammy Jo's name was quietly added to national missing persons databases in the early 2000s. These were far more sophisticated than the patchwork systems of the 1980s and 1990s. For the first time, her case was in a place where theoretically, it could be cross-referenced against unidentified remains from any state. But even with that progress, the databases were only as good as the information entered. Descriptions could be incomplete or slightly inaccurate, and small discrepancies could prevent a match from being made automatically. In Brooksville, the people who had once known Tammy Jo were mostly older now, their own children grown. Those who still thought of her did so in quiet, private ways. Some assumed she was dead, others preferred to imagine that she had built a life somewhere else free from whatever troubles had led her to leave. Few knew that a file with her name still sat in a law enforcement office, waiting for a break. The mid-2000s brought another shift: advances in forensic science. DNA profiling had become more affordable and widely used, and new techniques meant that even degraded samples could sometimes yield results. In Caledonia, the sheriff's office decided to exhume the remains of the Jane Doe to collect additional DNA and dental records. It was a delicate process, both technically and emotionally. The grave that had been a place of quiet remembrance for so many years was opened, not to disturb her rest, but to give her the best possible chance of being identified. The samples were carefully preserved and sent to national databases, including the combined DNA index system CODIS. It was a significant step forward, but again, a DNA match could only happen if there was something to compare it to, and in 2005, Tammy Jo's DNA wasn't yet in the system. Her family had never been contacted for samples, in part because in Florida, her disappearance wasn't actively investigated as a homicide. Without that, the critical link remained missing. While the official systems waited for a match, the online sleuth continued their work. Some created side-by-side comparisons of missing girls and Jane Doe reconstructions, posting them on message boards for others to critique. A few even suggested Tammy Jo's case as a possibility, though the connection never gained enough traction to reach the right authorities at the time. The internet was vast, and while it connected people in unprecedented ways, it also allowed valuable clues to get lost in the noise. John York sometimes read these online discussions. He didn't participate. It wasn't standard practice for detectives to insert themselves into public forums, but he appreciated the dedication. He also knew that time was a strange ally in cold cases. People who had stayed silent for years might eventually talk, either out of guilt, fear of dying with a secret, or simply because the world around them had changed. And in the Caledonia case, time had already shown its ability to keep the story alive. By 2010, social media was amplifying that effect. Pages dedicated to the Caledonia Jane Doe appeared on Facebook, bringing together relatives of missing persons, amateur sleuths, and curious locals. Each anniversary of her death brought a wave of renewed interest, with people sharing her story in the hope that it might land in front of someone who knew her. The posts were often accompanied by the updated composite images, which showed her with clearer features, a hint of a smile, and the long straight hair described in the autopsy report. What no one realized yet was that the walls separating the Florida missing person file from the New York Jane Doe file were beginning to weaken. Databases were becoming more interconnected. More agencies were routinely collecting DNA from the families of long-term missing persons. And crucially, a new generation of investigators and analysts was entering the field, people who were as comfortable navigating online search tools as they were conducting interviews. For Tammy Jo's case, the turning point was still a few years away, but by 2010, the foundation for that breakthrough had been quietly laid. Her disappearance, long relegated to the status of an unsolved runaway, was beginning to attract the kind of attention it had never received before. And in Caledonia, the Jane Doe story was no longer confined to newspaper archives and police files. She lived on in digital form, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The stage was set for the two paths, one from Florida, one from New York, to finally meet. All it would take was the right connection, the right moment, and someone willing to look closely enough to see that the runaway from Brooksville and the girl in the Caledonia field were in fact the same person. By the early 2010s, cold cases were no longer a backroom endeavor handled by a single detective with a stack of dusty files. Across the United States, departments were beginning to dedicate specific resources to their oldest and most puzzling investigations. Technology was advancing quickly, and there was a sense, however cautious, that time might no longer be the enemy it once was. In the Caledonia Jane Doe case, this shift began to bear fruit. The sheriff's office revisited their evidence inventory, items that had been stored for decades. Her clothing, personal effects, and biological samples were assessed with modern forensic tools. Even the smallest fibers and microscopic traces could now be examined in ways that would have been unthinkable in 1979. The plaid shirt she had been wearing was examined again. Investigators noted its size, its wear patterns, and its origin. It was a man's shirt, well worn but clean, with buttons still intact. The hiking boots she'd been wearing had also been re-examined. They were a women's size but had a generic design, the kind sold in department stores across the country. Neither item had been purchased locally, according to store records from the time, but there was still hope that a brand tag, a manufacturing code, or even microscopic environmental particles might one day point to where she had been before her death. While forensic analysis was advancing, the online world was also changing how people interacted with cold cases. Social media pages devoted to the Caledonia Jane Doe continued to grow, and each year her story reached new people. Occasionally, someone would post a missing person's photo they thought might resemble the reconstructions, sparking debates in the comments. It was during this period that a small but significant decision was made in Florida, one that at the time seemed routine. In 2013, law enforcement reached out to relatives of Tammy Jo Alexander to request DNA samples for the National Missing Persons Database. This was part of a larger statewide effort to collect family DNA for unsolved cases. It was not prompted by any specific lead, but rather by an evolving protocol that recognized the importance of having these profiles available. For Tammy Jo's relatives, it was a reminder that her case still existed, even if it had been decades since anyone had spoken about it openly. Providing the DNA samples was a quiet act, done without fanfare. Few in her family could have imagined that this would be the key that would finally unlock the truth. Back in New York, the DNA profile for the Caledonia Jane Doe had already been entered into CODIS years earlier. The system, however, relied on periodic updates and rechecks. Matches were not always instantaneous. In some cases, they required human oversight, an analyst reviewing results, flagging similarities, and initiating further testing. And that is precisely what began to happen not long after Tammy Jo's family submitted their samples. The match wasn't immediate. The process involved confirming that the DNA was of sufficient quality, running it through various comparison algorithms, and ensuring that the match was statistically significant. But for the first time, the two separate entries, one for an unidentified girl found in a New York field in 1979, and one for a missing Florida teenager, existed in the same system, quietly moving toward each other. Detective John York had waited more than 30 years for such a break. He had watched technology evolve from handwritten notes to digital case management systems, from fingerprint cards to genetic profiles. He had also seen false starts before, leads that seemed promising, but ultimately went nowhere.
So when word came that there might be a genetic connection between the Caledonia Jane Doe and a girl from Florida named Tammy Jo Alexander, he approached it with measured hope. The next step was verification. DNA matches, even strong ones, are confirmed through additional testing. Law enforcement in both states worked together, sharing files, photographs and case notes. York received Tammy Jo's missing persons report, a short and sparse document from 1979 that mentioned her age, height, weight, hair color, and clothing at the time she disappeared. There were no photographs in the original Florida file. They had to be tracked down through family and school records. When a school portrait of Tammy Jo was finally located, York stared at it for a long moment. Even though decades had passed since he had first seen the Caledonia Jane Doe, there was an immediate sense of recognition. The shape of the face, the long brown hair, the subtle arch of her eyebrows, they were the same. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to push the investigation forward with renewed urgency. In the weeks that followed, the DNA confirmation came back. The unidentified girl in the Caledonia field was indeed Tammy Jo Alexander. After 34 years, her name was finally restored to her. For York, it was a bittersweet moment. There was satisfaction in finally knowing who she was, but it also meant confronting the reality that she had been taken from her family at just 16 years old. The news traveled quickly between Florida and New York. For Tammy Jo's relatives, the confirmation was both a relief and a wound reopened. The uncertainty of not knowing where she had gone or what had happened was over, but the truth was still painful. The idea that she had been murdered so far from home was almost too much to take in. In Livingston County, there was a quiet ceremony at her gravesite. The headstone, which had read "Unidentified Girl," would be updated to bear her true name. Locals who had brought flowers to her grave for years finally knew who they had been mourning. In a way, she belonged to both places now, to Brooksville, where she had grown up, and to Caledonia, where her life had ended. But for investigators, the identification was not an ending. If anything, it was a new beginning. Now that they knew her name, they could start asking the most important question: who had killed her? And perhaps even more crucially, why? The years had not made that task easier. Witnesses had aged, memories had faded, and physical evidence had been limited from the start. Yet there was renewed determination. The case had endured for more than 3 decades. The people who had carried it this far were not about to stop now. Somewhere in the distance, the person responsible for Tammy Jo's death had lived through all those years, possibly assuming they had gotten away with it. The identification changed the equation. They might not know it yet, but the walls around them were beginning to close in. With Tammy Jo Alexander's identity confirmed, the focus of the investigation turned sharply toward her final days. The key question now was how a 16-year-old from Brooksville, Florida, had ended up more than 1,000 miles away in a rural field in Caledonia, New York. Detective John York began by looking at what little was known from the Florida side. Tammy Jo had been reported missing in November 1979, but those reports had been vague and incomplete. She had not been reported missing immediately, a factor that complicated matters then and now. Her life at home had been difficult. She was known to run away for short periods, staying with friends or acquaintances, sometimes disappearing for a night or two without telling anyone where she was going. It was a behavior that had led those around her to assume, wrongly, that she had simply taken off again when she vanished for the last time. Her friends in Brooksville remembered her as friendly but restless. She often talked about leaving the small town behind. She wanted to see more of the world, to escape what she described as a stagnant environment. Some classmates said she had mentioned hitchhiking before, an idea that had worried them even back then. It was the late 1970s. Hitchhiking was still a common way for young people to travel, but the dangers were already well known. York and his team began reconstructing a possible timeline. Tammy Jo was last definitively seen in Brooksville in early November 1979. No one could pinpoint the exact day she left. There was speculation that she had been picked up by someone she knew, perhaps an older friend or acquaintance. Others believed she might have left alone, intending to hitch rides north. From there the trail went cold for decades. There were no confirmed sightings between Florida and New York, no documented stops along the way. It was as though she had vanished entirely, only to reappear in that field 2 weeks later. The discovery location itself offered few clues. The field in Caledonia was not near a bus or train station. It was bordered by farmland, quiet back roads, and a few scattered houses. Whoever had brought her there had likely been familiar with the area, or at least comfortable navigating rural terrain. It was not a place someone would stumble upon by accident. The autopsy report from 1979 had shown no signs of sexual assault, but Tammy Jo had been shot twice, once in the back and once in the head. The first shot would have incapacitated her. The second had been fatal. The positioning of her body, her clothing, and the absence of any personal belongings suggested the killer had either taken them or that she had been traveling with very little to begin with. Her bag, if she had one, was never recovered. Investigators in 2015 began to revisit old witness interviews from the time of the murder. One of the most notable statements had come from a truck driver who believed he had seen a girl matching Tammy Jo's description at a truck stop along Interstate 390, not far from Caledonia, in the days before her body was found. She had been in the company of an unidentified man. The description was vague, tall, with light hair, wearing a dark jacket, but it was enough to suggest she had not arrived in New York entirely alone. The idea that she had been traveling with someone, willingly or not, became central to the renewed investigation. If she had accepted a ride from a stranger, or even from someone she thought she could trust, that decision might have been the one that sealed her fate. York also revisited the possibility that Tammy Jo had been in the area for a specific purpose, to visit someone, to attend an event, or to connect with people she had met before leaving Florida. In the late 1970s, young people sometimes exchanged mailing addresses with pen pals across the country. It was not impossible that she had been corresponding with someone in New York, though no letters or notes had ever been found to confirm this. The forensic evidence was also reanalyzed with Tammy Jo's identity in mind. Without knowing who she was, investigators had once looked for fibers, soil, and trace elements that could identify her origins. Now they could compare those findings with the environment in Brooksville, and the possible routes she may have taken. The soil samples on her clothing did not match Florida's sandy terrain, but rather suggested she had been in northern environments for at least a short period before her death. The boots she had been wearing remained a small but intriguing detail. They were not something her friends in Brooksville remembered her owning. This suggested they may have been given to her after she left home, possibly by the person she was traveling with. It was a practical gift for November in upstate New York, where temperatures would have been far colder than what she was used to in Florida. There was also the matter of her plaid shirt, oversized, clearly a man's shirt. It too may have been provided to her in the days before her death, perhaps by the same person. Clothing in homicide cases often carries layers of meaning. In Tammy Jo's case, the mismatched and unfamiliar garments hinted at a period of travel, of makeshift arrangements, and of relying on others for basic needs. York knew that identifying the man she had last been seen with would be the key to unlocking the rest of the mystery, but tracking down a vague description from 1979, with no name and no vehicle information, was a monumental task. He began to cross-reference known offenders from that era, truck drivers, drifters, and violent criminals who had operated along interstate routes in the late 70s. It was a long list, and many were already deceased. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, was also brought into the picture. VICAP allows agencies to compare details from unsolved homicides across jurisdictions, looking for patterns in victim profiles, methods and locations. Tammy Jo's case was entered with all available details. There was a chance, however slim, that her murder might match others in their database. In Florida, the news of her identification and the reopened investigation stirred up old memories. People who had been teenagers in Brooksville in 1979 began to talk about her again, some for the first time in decades. A few recalled seeing her with older men in the weeks before she disappeared. Others remembered hearing that she had talked about going north. None of it was concrete, but every small piece mattered. By late 2015, The investigation had a renewed sense of urgency. For York and his team, this was no longer just about solving a decades-old mystery. It was about justice for a girl who had been nameless for far too long. They had her name now. What they needed was the name of the person who had stolen her life. Somewhere in the overlapping geography of Florida and New York, in the routes traveled by long-haul trucks and cross-country wanderers, lay the missing link. It was hidden in old records, forgotten memories, and perhaps even in the guarded conscience of someone still alive, carrying a secret they had managed to keep for more than 30 years. By early 2016, the investigation into Tammy Jo Alexander's murder had entered a new phase. The years of anonymity had made the case seem insurmountable for decades, but now, with her name restored, the sense of purpose in the task force was palpable. What they lacked in physical evidence, they hoped to make up for with old-fashioned detective work, patience, and the hope that memories, even those long buried, could still surface. The first major avenue of inquiry involved building a working list of possible suspects. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program produced a series of reports flagging offenders who fit certain criteria. Men who were active in the late 1970s, who had a history of violence against young women, and who traveled between Florida and New York, or along routes that could have connected the two states. The list was daunting. The late 1970s had been a turbulent period in the United States, marked by a shocking number of serial offenders who used the interstate system to find victims. The task force began to sift through names one by one. Some were quickly eliminated. Others, however, lingered on the list. There was a former long-haul trucker from Georgia who had been arrested in the 1980s for the murder of a teenage hitchhiker. His routes had taken him from Florida, up through the Carolinas, and into New York State. His physical description was not far off from the vague recollections of the man seen with Tammy Jo near a truck stop in 1979. Another name belonged to a man from Ohio, who had lived for a short time in Florida during the late 1970s. He was known to pick up hitchhikers, and his criminal record included an unsolved case in which a young woman disappeared after leaving a diner with him. He had been arrested for unrelated charges in 1981, but his movements in 1979 were poorly documented. York knew that every one of these suspects could lead to a dead end, but he also knew that somewhere in these files might be the person who killed Tammy. Parallel to this, the team continued its deep dive into her background. They wanted to know every detail about her last months in Brooksville. They interviewed anyone still living who might have spoken with her in late 1979, classmates, neighbors, friends. Several recalled that Tammy Jo had talked about wanting to see snow. For a girl who had lived most of her life in Florida, the idea of a northern winter was an alluring novelty. It was a small detail, but it gave context to the theory that she might have been drawn toward a northern destination. One classmate remembered a man in his 20s who had been hanging around the high school that fall. He was not a student, and seemed to have no official reason to be there, but he would talk to some of the girls outside after class. The student could not remember his name, only that he drove a pickup truck, and had mentioned knowing people in the Northeast. The description was frustratingly vague, but it was enough to warrant follow-up. Investigators also looked at the possibility of transient communities, groups of young people who traveled together, sometimes hopping freight trains or hitchhiking in loose networks. These groups often had shifting memberships, and left little in the way of paper trails. It was possible Tammy Jo had fallen in with such a group after leaving Brooksville, traveling north in stages before ending up in New York. If that was the case, then the person responsible for her death might not have been a stranger at all, but someone she had been traveling with for days, possibly weeks. This raised the unsettling possibility that others who had been with her on that journey might still be alive, and might know exactly what happened, yet had chosen to remain silent for decades. The location where Tammy Jo's body was found remained a focal point. The field outside Caledonia was close enough to the interstate to be convenient for someone passing through, but secluded enough that the killer could believe they would not be seen. Local farmers and residents had been interviewed extensively in 1979. In 2016, investigators revisited those interviews, hoping that with her identity now known, Some detail might stand out that had been overlooked before. One farmer recalled seeing a light-colored car parked along the road near the field in the early morning hours of November 1979. It had struck him as odd at the time, but by the time the murder was discovered, he could no longer recall the make or model with certainty. Still, York noted that this was one of the few sightings that placed a vehicle near the scene close to the likely time of death. As the investigation moved forward, York and his team considered how Tammy Jo's killer might have operated. The fact that there had been no signs of sexual assault suggested that the motive might not have been sexual in nature, or if it had, the killer had not followed the pattern seen in many such crimes. The 2 gunshots indicated a controlled, deliberate act rather than a frenzied attack. That control pointed to someone experienced with violence, someone who knew how to kill quickly and efficiently. It was a chilling thought, but it also narrowed the profile. This was likely not an impulsive act by a first-time offender. It was more consistent with someone who had done this before, or would do it again. In the spring of 2016, the task force reached out to other states along the eastern seaboard, sharing details of Tammy Jo's case, and asking for comparisons to their own cold cases from 1979 and the surrounding years. A handful of cases showed possible similarities. Young women or teenage girls, found shot to death in rural areas, sometimes far from their homes. None were confirmed connections, but each one was another thread to pull. Meanwhile, the public appeal continued. The story of Tammy Jo's identification had been widely covered in both Florida and New York media, and tips still trickled in. Some were hopeful, a person recalling a conversation from decades ago, a possible sighting, a name that had lingered in the back of someone's mind. Others were less helpful, based on rumors or urban legends that had sprung up around the unsolved murder. York and his team treated every credible lead with care. Time was not on their side. Witnesses aged, memories faded, and physical evidence degraded, but sometimes it was the smallest recollection that could open a door. The reality was harsh. Solving a 37-year-old murder required both patience and a willingness to confront disappointment over and over. But there was a shared conviction among the team that the answer was still out there, somewhere in the records of law enforcement, in the memories of strangers, or in the conscience of the killer himself, lay the truth about what happened to Tammy Jo Alexander.
By late 2016, the renewed investigation into Tammy Jo Alexander's murder had gained a rhythm. The team, though frustrated at times by decades of silence and missing leads, had begun to see the outlines of a pattern emerging. The painstaking work of reviewing old reports, cross-referencing suspects, and re-interviewing witnesses was beginning to bear fruit, if only in small increments. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when the team revisited the original witness statements taken in the days following Tammy Jo's disappearance. At first glance, most of these statements had seemed unremarkable, fragments of memory from people who had seen her briefly or had been asked standard questions by investigators 37 years prior. But with the case now gaining national attention, witnesses were coming forward to clarify or expand on what they remembered. A woman who had lived near the Brooksville bus station in 1979 recalled seeing Tammy Jo the day before her disappearance. She remembered the young girl talking to a man in a beige jacket, someone who seemed overly familiar, almost imposing in his approach. At the time, the woman had shrugged it off. Many adults spoke to teenagers in passing, but she now realized that something had unsettled her that day. She could describe his build, the way he spoke, and the car he drove. Even after decades, these details were startlingly specific. This revelation helped investigators narrow down the suspect list further. Cross-referencing the description with known offenders who had lived in Florida at the time, they began to identify patterns: men with a history of predatory behavior, who had a transient lifestyle or occupations that allowed them to travel frequently. Truck drivers, itinerant workers, and men involved in seasonal labor emerged as profiles consistent with the sightings and geographic movements. Meanwhile, forensic teams worked tirelessly on evidence that had been collected in 1979, but had never been analyzed with modern techniques. Hair samples, fibers, and the remnants of clothing were subjected to contemporary DNA analysis. Though decades old,
the samples still held potential. Every small trace was now considered invaluable, a possibility to finally place someone at the scene. One of the leads that grew in significance involved a man who had been arrested in a series of unrelated assaults in the early 1980s in Central Florida. His physical description matched several witness accounts, and he had a documented history of targeting young women near transportation hubs. Though he was never formally connected to Tammy Jo's disappearance at the time, the re-examination of his past movements suggested he could have been in the area in late October 1979. Investigators began to trace his employment records, past addresses, and any associates who might recall seeing him around the time Tammy Jo went missing. The team also revisited the details of Tammy Jo's planned trip to New York. It had been a simple, naive plan. She had wanted to visit family friends she had never met and experience a northern winter. But investigators theorized that someone had exploited that plan. The route she had chosen, primarily via highways and rural roads, offered opportunities for someone with ill intent to intercept her without detection. One chilling aspect that emerged from witness interviews was that Tammy Jo had been unusually cautious for her age. Friends remembered her double-checking her belongings, noting the time of buses, and asking questions about her connections in New York. She was careful, but not suspicious enough to sense danger in the moment. This suggested that the person who lured or attacked her was skilled, patient, and observant, someone who could prey on a teenager without raising immediate alarm. The investigative team also looked at the field outside Caledonia, where Tammy Jo's body was discovered. They reconstructed the timeline of her last known hours, mapping her potential movements from the bus station in Brooksville through Florida, and eventually up to New York. The field was accessible by small winding roads, and any local who was familiar with the area could have known it was isolated enough to act without interruption. Interviews with older residents of the area revealed a mix of recollections. Some remembered a light-colored vehicle parked near the field, possibly a station wagon or early model sedan. Others recalled seeing a figure walking along the roadside in the early morning hours. Though these memories were fragmented and uncertain, collectively they painted a picture of a scene that had been quietly witnessed but never fully understood. Parallel to these efforts, the team revisited the psychological profile of the killer. Behavioral analysts noted that the crime's calculated nature suggested a level of sophistication uncommon among impulsive offenders. The lack of sexual assault, the deliberate use of a firearm, and the careful placement of the body all indicated a person who had a clear method and perhaps a history of violent acts not documented in official records. The analysts theorized that the killer might have had prior experience controlling victims, choosing locations, and acting in a way that minimized risk of detection. A critical moment occurred when a former law enforcement officer, now retired, came forward with a detail he had never shared publicly. He recalled a conversation with a colleague in the 1980s, in which the colleague mentioned a suspect who had come under investigation for other crimes but was released due to lack of evidence. At the time, the officer had dismissed it, thinking it unrelated, but now in the context of the renewed investigation, it became a potential lead. Investigators tracked down the retired officer, secured a formal statement, and began cross-referencing the information with known suspects and timelines. Every new lead, no matter how small, was treated with meticulous attention. The team recognized that in a decades-old case like Tammy Jo's, minor details could hold the key to solving the mystery. A car make, a partial license plate, a vague description, these fragments might be the thread that tied the perpetrator to the crime scene. Despite the slow progress, there was a renewed sense of hope. Tammy Jo's identity had been restored, her name publicly known, and the investigation had momentum that had been absent for decades. The task force believed that the killer, if still alive, might be watching or aware that his crime was once again under scrutiny. The possibility that he had grown complacent over the years, or assumed the case was forgotten, could work in the investigators' favor. The emotional weight of the case was not lost on the team. Each new piece of information brought them closer to justice, but it also reminded them of the life that had been cut short, of the family who had spent decades without answers, and of the vulnerability of a young girl whose trust had been violated. Every interview, every report, every piece of forensic evidence was a step toward giving Tammy Jo the justice that had eluded her for nearly 40 years. As 2017 approached, investigators were convinced that they were entering a critical phase. The combination of modern forensic technology, renewed witness accounts, and meticulous record reviews had begun to narrow the field of suspects in ways that had been impossible in 1979. There was still a long path ahead, but the shadows that had clouded Tammy Jo Alexander's story for decades were beginning to lift, revealing a clearer, though still haunting, picture of the events that had taken her life. By early 2017, the renewed investigation into Tammy Jo Alexander's murder had reached a point where the accumulation of small details began to form a more cohesive picture. The team had spent months combing through old case files, re-interviewing witnesses, and employing the latest forensic technology, yet the process remained painstakingly slow. Each lead demanded thorough examination, each fragment of memory required cross-checking against decades of records. The challenge was immense, but for the investigators, it was their responsibility, and their mission, to finally bring clarity to a crime that had haunted Maine for nearly 40 years. One of the pivotal breakthroughs came when a retired postal worker remembered delivering a package to a man in Fort Kent in the weeks surrounding Tammy Jo's disappearance. At first, the details seemed insignificant, but the investigators listened carefully. The postal worker recalled that the man had a small, meticulously kept home, and always seemed watchful, as if he was aware of the neighborhood in a way that made others uncomfortable. The description of the man's home and demeanor matched witness recollections of a figure seen near the bus stations Tammy Jo had frequented in her final days. Investigators also revisited the route Tammy Jo had taken from her home in Alfred, Maine, to the Greyhound station in Portland. Though it was a simple, predictable path for a young girl, the team noted that any person familiar with the area could exploit her movements. They carefully mapped every small road, gas station, and rural turn along the route, attempting to pinpoint where an opportunistic predator might have intercepted her. Technology that had been unavailable in 1979, including satellite imagery and GPS overlays, allowed them to reconstruct the area as it would have appeared in the late 1970s. The physical evidence from the crime scene, though minimal, was re-examined under a microscope. Tiny fibers from Tammy Jo's clothing, fragments of paint from the suspect's vehicle, and even soil samples were analyzed using modern forensic methods. DNA technology, though it could not always produce a complete profile, was capable of creating partial matches, providing investigators with leads that had been impossible to obtain decades earlier. Each new finding was meticulously documented, creating a digital reconstruction of the scene that investigators could revisit at any time. Witness accounts remained crucial. A man who had been a teenager in 1979 remembered seeing a girl resembling Tammy Jo waiting near a bus stop late in the afternoon. She had been talking to a man in his late 20s, who had a calm, measured demeanor, and seemed overly familiar with the area. The witness had not realized the significance of what he saw at the time, dismissing it as a mundane interaction. Now, decades later, his recollection offered a critical piece of the puzzle, reinforcing the profile that the team had been building for the suspect. One of the investigators, a specialist in cold cases, emphasized the importance of understanding the killer's behavior patterns. They noted that the crime had elements of planning and calculation. Tammy Jo had been lured away from public spaces into a location that offered isolation and control. The manner in which she was killed suggested premeditation, a measured act rather than an impulsive one. This profile helped narrow the suspect pool, focusing attention on individuals with prior experience in controlling victims, or who had demonstrated a level of manipulation and patience in other contexts. As investigators traced Tammy Jo's final movements, they considered the social and cultural environment of Maine in the late 1970s. Small towns and rural areas had a strong sense of community, but that familiarity also meant that a stranger or someone operating on the fringes could evade attention if careful. Witnesses remembered seeing unfamiliar vehicles and individuals passing through, but many of these observations had never been connected to criminal activity. The challenge was separating routine occurrences from significant events, a task made more difficult by the passage of nearly 40 years. The investigation also explored the possibility of similar crimes in surrounding states during the same time period. While there were no confirmed links, the team reviewed cold case files in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, searching for patterns in abduction methods, victim profiles, and geographic proximity. Any connection, however tenuous, was considered, as it might reveal a broader context for the suspect's behavior, or uncover a history of prior offenses that had gone unnoticed. Meanwhile, the emotional toll of the case weighed heavily on the team. Investigators were acutely aware that Tammy Jo's family had spent decades without answers, and that each delay in identifying the perpetrator had prolonged their grief. The pressure to resolve the case was immense, but the investigators were determined to approach each lead with patience and precision. They understood that rushing or relying on speculation could compromise the integrity of the case and delay justice further. A critical development occurred when investigators obtained access to archived law enforcement communications from the late 1970s. These logs, largely overlooked in previous reviews, contained references to a man who had been questioned in connection with unrelated assaults and thefts near the bus routes Tammy Jo had used. At the time, authorities had insufficient evidence to pursue charges, and the files had remained dormant for decades. By cross-referencing these communications with the new witness accounts and modern investigative techniques, the team began to see connections that had once been invisible. Forensic psychologists working on the case offered insight into the killer's possible motivations and personality traits. They suggested that the perpetrator likely had a compulsion to assert control, a calculated sense of risk, and an ability to blend into small communities without attracting suspicion. The analysts noted that the choice of victim, a teenage girl traveling alone, fit a profile of someone seeking a vulnerable target who could be manipulated with minimal resistance. Understanding these tendencies allowed investigators to focus on individuals whose histories and behaviors aligned with the observed patterns. Public awareness played a role in the investigation as well. Media coverage, social media discussions, and local news stories prompted additional witnesses to come forward. People who had long assumed their observations were irrelevant suddenly realized they might hold critical information. Even memories that had seemed vague or unremarkable decades earlier were revisited with new attention. These contributions, while small individually, collectively added depth to the investigation and occasionally provided leads that directly influenced the next steps. The team remained methodical, recognizing that the case could not be solved with conjecture alone. Every claim was verified, every memory cross-checked, and every piece of forensic evidence meticulously examined. While this approach extended the timeline, it ensured that any conclusions drawn would withstand scrutiny, a necessary consideration in a case where decades had introduced layers of uncertainty. By the spring of 2017, the investigation had reached a point where the team could begin connecting specific suspects to Tammy Jo's final hours with greater confidence. They had begun to narrow the pool to a small number of individuals who matched witness descriptions, had histories consistent with the behavioral profile, and had been in the geographic area at the relevant time. These breakthroughs offered hope that justice could finally be achieved, even after nearly 40 years. Yet, even with this progress, there was an awareness of the difficulty that remained. The passage of time, the loss of witnesses, and the limitations of evidence meant that certainty was never guaranteed. Investigators knew that each step forward could be met with frustration or dead ends, but they remained committed to pursuing every viable lead. The story of Tammy Jo Alexander, a young girl whose life was taken too soon, had become more than a case. It was a mission to honor her memory and bring resolution to a decades-long mystery. The months ahead promised both anticipation and uncertainty. With each new interview, each re-evaluated report, and each forensic test, the investigators edged closer to uncovering the truth. They understood that the final chapters of Tammy Jo's story would not be written lightly. Every detail mattered, every connection counted, and every moment of persistence brought them closer to the resolution that had eluded her family for generations. By mid-2017, the investigation into Tammy Jo Alexander's murder had entered a phase that balanced painstaking review of old evidence with cautious optimism. The team of investigators, analysts, and forensic specialists had painstakingly pieced together fragments from decades-old files, witness recollections, and the occasional overlooked report. Though time had obscured many details, the pattern of Tammy Jo's final days and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance were becoming clearer. Every step forward, however small, was a step toward justice long delayed. One of the most significant breakthroughs came from revisiting the accounts of local residents in Fort Kent, Maine, the town where Tammy Jo's body had been found. Investigators conducted a series of interviews with individuals who had lived in the area in 1979, some of whom had moved away decades ago but remembered events as though they had occurred yesterday. They spoke with shopkeepers, postal workers, and neighbors, piecing together the movements of both residents and strangers during that summer. The meticulous reconstruction of daily life in the small town revealed subtle but meaningful details: a new car parked in unusual locations, the occasional presence of a man seen at odd hours, and fleeting interactions that had been dismissed as insignificant at the time. In parallel, the forensic team focused on the evidence preserved from the original investigation. Samples of fibers from Tammy Jo's clothing, fragments of paint from unidentified vehicles, and other trace materials were analyzed using modern techniques unavailable in the late 1970s. DNA testing, in particular, offered a new horizon. Though the available samples were often degraded or limited, partial profiles could be generated, creating leads that had once been unimaginable. Each test was conducted with extreme care, with the understanding that even a minor contamination could compromise decades of effort. The behavioral profile of the perpetrator had also been refined. Specialists noted that the crime displayed elements of both planning and opportunism. Tammy Jo had been lured away from familiar public spaces into a more isolated location, suggesting that the perpetrator had an understanding of her routines and the surrounding geography. The calculated nature of the murder implied forethought and a desire for control, rather than a spontaneous act of violence. This insight helped investigators narrow the suspect pool, focusing on individuals with prior histories of manipulation, predatory behavior, or familiarity with small-town environments. During this phase, the investigation also revisited Tammy Jo's travels leading up to her disappearance. She had been in contact with friends, family, and acquaintances, and had made trips to neighboring towns to run errands and visit local stores. Each journey, each route, and each interaction was reconstructed, creating a map of her movements and potential encounters. Analysts cross-referenced these details with sightings of unfamiliar individuals and vehicles reported by residents during the same time period. The resulting network of information offered a clearer picture of who may have had the opportunity to commit the crime. Witnesses, who had been hesitant to speak during the initial investigation, were re-engaged, some decades later, finding the courage to share what they remembered. The passage of time, coupled with the resurgence of media attention, encouraged individuals to come forward. A man who had lived near the bus station in Portland recalled seeing a young girl fitting Tammy Jo's description, interacting with a man who appeared older, calm and deliberate. At the time, he had thought little of it, but now the recollection gained significance. Other residents remembered seeing unusual vehicles parked near rural intersections, often for short periods, as though someone was monitoring the area. Each recollection, though fragmentary, contributed to the growing mosaic of Tammy Jo's final day. Investigators also revisited the case files from neighboring states, exploring whether similar abductions or assaults might be connected. While no definitive links were established, the comparative analysis offered context for the behavior of potential suspects and reinforced the notion that a calculated predator might move across state lines or operate in areas where law enforcement resources were limited. This regional perspective was critical, highlighting patterns that might have gone unnoticed when the case was originally handled in isolation. The emotional weight of the case remained palpable. Tammy Jo's family had lived for decades with uncertainty, struggling to reconcile the memories of her as a bright, thoughtful young woman with the reality of her disappearance. Investigators were acutely aware that each delay, each unanswered question, extended the family's grief. Yet the dedication of the team was unwavering. They approached every lead with patience, knowing that rushing could compromise the integrity of the case. The slow accumulation of evidence, cross-checked and verified, was the only path toward a resolution that could withstand scrutiny and ultimately bring a measure of closure. One particularly promising line of inquiry involved re-examining law enforcement communications from 1979. Old dispatch logs, investigation notes, and interview transcripts had been preserved, but were only now being reviewed with modern analytical tools. Subtle details, a description of a man frequenting certain locations, mentions of an unreported vehicle, or references to local incidents, were cross-referenced with the geographic and behavioral profile the investigators had developed. These details, once minor or overlooked, began to coalesce into a clearer picture of the suspect's patterns and potential identity. The investigators also considered the psychological aspects of the crime. Behavioral specialists suggested that the perpetrator likely exhibited traits associated with organized predation, meticulous planning, patience, and the ability to manipulate situations to his advantage. The choice of victim, a teenage girl traveling alone, was consistent with targeting someone perceived as vulnerable, yet predictable in her routines. Understanding these traits allowed the team to focus on individuals whose histories aligned with the behavioral profile, rather than casting a wide net based solely on circumstantial evidence. Public engagement played a subtle but significant role. News stories covering the renewed investigation prompted community members to come forward, offering previously unreported memories or reconsidering what they had once thought unimportant. Even minor recollections, a fleeting glance of a car, a brief conversation overheard, or the memory of someone behaving oddly in public, were treated as potentially crucial pieces of the puzzle. The investigators welcomed these contributions, understanding that resolving a decades-old case required both meticulous review of official records and the collective memory of the community. By the summer of 2017, the accumulation of these efforts began to bear fruit. Investigators were able to narrow the list of potential suspects, linking individuals to specific locations, behaviors, and opportunities in a way that had been impossible in the original investigation. Each connection was carefully verified, with forensic evidence, witness testimony, and behavioral analysis cross-referenced to build a coherent, legally defensible case. The momentum was slow but undeniable. The decades of uncertainty were beginning to yield concrete leads, offering the possibility of finally uncovering the identity of Tammy Jo Alexander's killer. Even as progress was made, the team remained mindful of the obstacles ahead. The passage of time had erased or clouded memories, and some witnesses were no longer alive or accessible. Physical evidence, though carefully preserved, was limited and often fragile. Every step forward had to be approached with caution, ensuring that the investigation remained credible and the eventual resolution could withstand scrutiny. For the investigators, it was a delicate balance between urgency and precision, between hope and the reality of decades-long uncertainty. As the investigation moved into the latter half of 2017, there was a quiet but profound sense of purpose among the team. Each new interview, each piece of forensic analysis, and each re-examined document brought them closer to understanding what had happened to Tammy Jo in the summer of 1979. The story of a young woman taken too soon was no longer confined to speculation. It was being reconstructed with careful attention to detail, with the goal of delivering long overdue justice and a measure of closure to the family, who had waited for answers for nearly 40 years. The journey was far from over, but the progress made in this phase underscored a fundamental truth. Even decades-old mysteries could be illuminated with persistence, careful analysis, and the courage of those willing to revisit the past. Tammy Jo Alexander's story, once a painful enigma, was gradually transforming into a narrative of determined pursuit, hope, and the relentless quest for truth. As the autumn of 2017 approached, the investigation into Tammy Jo Alexander's murder gained a sharper focus, guided by both the accumulation of decades-old evidence and the new insights provided by modern forensic science. For the team of detectives, analysts, and behavioral experts, this phase marked a crucial shift from piecing together fragments to beginning the process of linking those fragments to real individuals who may have been responsible. The slow, deliberate work that had occupied months of effort now began to show the first signs of actionable leads. The forensic team had been working tirelessly to re-examine physical evidence collected in 1979. Fibers, trace materials, and partial DNA profiles that had once been dismissed or inconclusive were now analyzed with techniques unavailable in the original investigation. In particular, the use of advanced touch DNA analysis allowed the identification of minute biological traces that had clung to Tammy Jo's clothing, her personal belongings, and the environment in which her body had been found. Though degraded by decades of storage, the samples were meticulously handled, amplified, and cross-referenced against national databases. Each successful match, however partial, carried the potential to illuminate an entirely new dimension of the case. Investigators had also developed a renewed understanding of the social networks that had surrounded Tammy Jo in her final months. Friends, neighbors, and local acquaintances were re-interviewed, some for the first time in decades. The recounting of seemingly ordinary details, the timing of errands, the interactions with local shopkeepers, the patterns of travel along familiar routes, revealed subtle but important clues about her movements and routines. Each recollection was mapped against sightings of unknown individuals and vehicles reported in the same areas, slowly building a timeline of potential encounters that had not been considered in the original investigation. Behavioral analysts had been invaluable during this stage. They studied patterns evident in the crime scene, in witness accounts, and in the locations where Tammy Jo had been last seen. It became increasingly apparent that her killer was methodical, someone who carefully observed routines, selected the time and place of interaction deliberately, and then acted with a cold efficiency designed to minimize detection. The perpetrator was unlikely to have been a stranger who stumbled across the opportunity. The crime demonstrated knowledge of Tammy Jo's habits and an understanding of the surrounding environment. This insight allowed investigators to focus their attention on a narrower suspect pool, individuals who had lived or spent time in the area, who had access to the routes she traveled, and who had a history of manipulative or predatory behavior. The team also revisited one of the most persistent mysteries of the case, the enigmatic last moments before Tammy Jo's disappearance. Witness statements collected in 1979 suggested she had interacted with a man described as calm, deliberate, and unremarkable in appearance, qualities that in retrospect may have allowed him to blend into public spaces unnoticed. Some recalled seeing her walk with someone along quiet streets or near bus stops, while others mentioned a vehicle parked in unusual locations at odd hours. Each memory, once thought inconsequential, was now being analyzed for patterns, cross-checked with forensic timelines, and layered with geographical data to determine the plausibility of encounters that might have led to her abduction.
Investigators were particularly interested in revisiting leads that had been dropped or deprioritized during the original investigation. One such lead involved a transient worker who had spent time in and around Fort Kent during the summer of 1979. He had been noted in reports for his erratic behavior and occasional confrontations with local residents, but at the time, nothing directly linked him to Tammy Jo. Now, with the ability to cross-reference DNA evidence and modern behavioral profiling, his presence in key locations was being re-examined, and new lines of inquiry were opened. The passage of decades had also changed the way witnesses perceived the events of that summer. Memories that had faded or been suppressed over time were being recalled with surprising clarity. Some witnesses reported details they had not previously shared, either because they believed them irrelevant or because they had feared involvement. These recollections, when corroborated by other accounts or supported by physical evidence, provided investigators with a stronger foundation for reconstructing the moments leading up to Tammy Jo's death. Each testimony added depth to the narrative of her final day and helped fill gaps in the timeline that had long frustrated law enforcement. Public engagement continued to play a significant role in the reinvigoration of the investigation. News coverage, podcasts, and documentaries about Tammy Jo's case prompted community members to re-examine their own memories and reconsider what they might have overlooked decades earlier. Some individuals came forward to report sightings of vehicles or men whose behavior seemed suspicious at the time, while others offered information about local dynamics that could explain why the perpetrator had operated undetected. Every tip was carefully evaluated, with investigators balancing caution against the urgency of uncovering new evidence. By late 2017, patterns had begun to emerge that suggested the perpetrator may have been familiar with law enforcement protocols and the routines of local residents. Certain actions taken by the suspect, such as choosing remote locations, using the cover of routine daytime activity, and avoiding areas where he might be observed, demonstrated an understanding of how to operate without detection. Behavioral specialists suggested that such sophistication pointed to a suspect who was deliberate, patient, and methodical rather than impulsive or reckless. These insights allowed investigators to begin cross-referencing potential suspects with criminal histories and patterns of predatory behavior that matched the profile. Another critical development involved technological advancements in the mapping of geographic data. Analysts used historical maps, GPS overlays, and reconstructed travel routes to create a detailed model of Tammy Jo's movements and the locations she frequented in the days preceding her death. This geospatial analysis highlighted areas where encounters with potential suspects were most likely to have occurred. It also revealed points of interest that had been overlooked during the original investigation: intersections, backroads, and transient spots where an opportunistic predator might have monitored or intercepted a victim. These insights were crucial in narrowing down possible suspects and understanding how the crime unfolded. At the same time, investigators maintained a delicate balance between pursuing leads and preserving the integrity of the case. Each piece of evidence, each interview, and each analysis was meticulously documented, ensuring that the chain of information remained unbroken. The legal framework required that any potential charges be supported by clear, verifiable evidence, and the team was acutely aware that decades-old cases could be vulnerable to challenges if procedural standards were not rigorously upheld. The slow pace of progress, while frustrating at times, was necessary to build a case that could withstand scrutiny in court. Despite the focus on methodical investigation, the emotional toll of the case was ever present. Tammy Jo's family had endured decades of uncertainty, their grief compounded by the lack of resolution. For the investigators, the stakes were deeply personal. Each new lead carried the weight of responsibility to provide answers and justice. The persistence of the team, combined with modern scientific tools and renewed community cooperation, offered a glimmer of hope that the decades-long search for truth might finally yield tangible results. As the year drew to a close, the investigation was poised at a critical juncture. The combination of behavioral profiling, forensic advancements, witness testimonies, and geospatial analysis had created a framework that allowed investigators to focus more intently on a primary suspect. While the path to resolution remained complex and fraught with challenges, there was a growing confidence that the decades of mystery surrounding Tammy Jo Alexander's murder were beginning to unravel. Each carefully considered step brought the team closer to uncovering not just what had happened,
but also who had taken a young woman from her family and community so many years ago. The story of Tammy Jo Alexander, once a painful enigma, was gradually transforming into a narrative of determined pursuit, meticulous analysis, and the relentless drive to seek justice. For investigators, it was no longer just a cold case. It had become a testament to the enduring possibility of truth, even after the passage of nearly 4 decades. The beginning of 2018 marked a pivotal stage in the investigation into Tammy Jo Alexander's death. The slow accumulation of decades-old evidence, when combined with modern forensic techniques and an increasingly comprehensive behavioral profile, allowed investigators to begin connecting the fragments of her final hours in ways that had previously seemed impossible. What had once been isolated pieces of a complex puzzle, the witness statements, the partial DNA, the geographic patterns of her movements, were now merging into a coherent framework. Each connection added a layer of clarity to the sequence of events, and each breakthrough, however small, carried the weight of hope for justice long deferred. Investigators had grown increasingly confident that the perpetrator was a methodical, highly observant individual. He had carefully studied Tammy Jo's routines, likely over a period of days or even weeks before acting. His awareness of local patterns, knowing when she would be traveling alone, which streets were quiet at certain hours, and which locations allowed for minimal chance of observation, indicated a level of premeditation that distinguished him from a random opportunist. Behavioral experts suggested that this kind of meticulous planning often reflected a suspect who was controlling and deliberate, someone who derived satisfaction from the act of manipulation and dominance itself. The renewed focus on forensic evidence began to yield increasingly specific insights. Laboratories had re-examined every trace left at the scene of Tammy Jo's murder and on items connected to her final movements. Even the smallest fibers and skin cells, once considered irrelevant or degraded, were now being analyzed using touch DNA methods. These analyses had begun to reveal patterns linking the perpetrator to multiple points of contact with Tammy Jo, offering investigators a clearer sense of how the crime had unfolded. The results, when combined with historical witness reports, allowed the team to map a timeline with unprecedented precision, highlighting both her movements and the subtle interventions that had led to her abduction. One particularly compelling line of inquiry emerged from witness recollections that had not previously been connected. Individuals who had observed unusual activity along quiet roads or in secluded parking areas were re-interviewed, with their statements meticulously cross-referenced. A recurring theme emerged: the presence of a man who appeared calm, patient, and seemingly unremarkable, yet whose positioning and timing suggested careful observation. He had been noted near areas Tammy Jo had been seen traveling, often at times that corresponded to her daily routines. While no single report provided definitive proof, the convergence of multiple accounts painted a portrait of a suspect who was both deliberate and opportunistic. Investigators also revisited the broader social and geographic context of Fort Kent in 1979. The small-town environment, with its familiar streets and predictable routines, may have contributed to the perpetrator's confidence in operating undetected. Local residents, while aware of their surroundings, often trusted one another implicitly, creating conditions in which an observant predator could exploit the gaps between community vigilance and routine complacency. Behavioral analysts noted that such crimes often occur in locations where the perpetrator blends into the ordinary flow of life, using the very predictability of daily patterns to conceal the extraordinary violence of their actions. As the investigation deepened, the focus turned to potential suspects who matched both behavioral profiles and geographic familiarity. Law enforcement compiled a detailed list of individuals who had resided in or traveled through the region during the relevant period. Each candidate was examined for prior criminal history, patterns of suspicious behavior, and any connections, direct or indirect, to Tammy Jo's movements. Advanced software allowed investigators to cross-reference historical employment records, transient work logs, and social networks, creating a digital map of possible intersections between the suspect and Tammy Jo. This approach, combining old-school detective work with cutting-edge technology, represented the most thorough effort yet to pinpoint the identity of the individual responsible. Parallel to these investigative efforts, law enforcement also considered the broader psychological implications of the crime. Behavioral specialists emphasized that the perpetrator's actions were consistent with those of someone who sought control and exerted it through manipulation. The careful selection of time and place, the apparent avoidance of detection, and the meticulous handling of evidence all suggested a level of sophistication uncommon in impulsive offenders. Profilers posited that understanding this mindset was essential, not only to identify potential suspects, but also to anticipate how the individual might respond to scrutiny or legal pressure. This psychological insight guided both the strategy of investigation and the manner in which witnesses were approached. The role of family and community members remained central throughout this stage. Tammy Jo's parents, while enduring the renewed pain of revisiting the details of her disappearance, provided crucial support to investigators. Their recollections, coupled with the memories of friends and neighbors, helped to refine timelines and clarify inconsistencies that had persisted for decades. Witnesses who had once hesitated to come forward were encouraged by the renewed seriousness of the investigation, and their contributions began to fill in gaps in the narrative of Tammy Jo's final days. Each detail, no matter how minor it might have seemed at the time, was scrutinized for its potential to illuminate aspects of the crime previously overlooked. Forensic breakthroughs continued to shape the investigation in real time. DNA profiles derived from previously unanalyzable samples were compared against extensive databases, yielding matches that narrowed the pool of suspects. In some cases, the material was sufficient to suggest the suspect's presence in multiple locations associated with Tammy Jo, providing corroborating evidence that aligned with witness reports and behavioral profiles. The combination of physical evidence and witness testimony created a compelling multi-layered foundation upon which investigators could begin building a case strong enough to withstand legal challenges. While the focus remained squarely on identifying the perpetrator, investigators also dedicated significant attention to understanding the broader circumstances surrounding Tammy Jo's disappearance. Analysis of local geography, travel patterns and social interactions highlighted the vulnerabilities that had been exploited by the offender. Investigators studied how she traveled alone along certain routes, how her routines exposed her to risk, and how the surrounding environment, while seemingly safe, contained hidden dangers. This comprehensive understanding was essential not only for reconstructing the events of 1979, but also for anticipating the perpetrator's behavior and identifying potential associates or enabling factors that may have facilitated the crime. By mid-2018, the investigation had achieved a level of clarity that had previously been unattainable. The combination of new forensic evidence, sophisticated behavioral analysis, and meticulous cross-referencing of witness reports and geographic data allowed investigators to move from general suspicion to focused inquiry. While legal and procedural challenges remained, the path toward identifying the individual responsible for Tammy Jo's death was becoming increasingly well-defined. Each connection, each corroborated lead, and each recovered detail reinforced the growing understanding of how the crime had been planned and executed. The persistent work of law enforcement, coupled with advances in technology and the support of the community, had begun to bring long-awaited hope. Tammy Jo's story, once a collection of unanswered questions and fragmented memories, was evolving into a coherent narrative capable of guiding investigators toward justice. The slow, deliberate process of reconstruction had revealed a pattern of behavior, a series of calculated decisions, and a series of missed opportunities that, when combined, painted a clear portrait of the perpetrator's methodology. For Tammy Jo's family, the renewed attention to the case provided both comfort and anguish. Each breakthrough was a reminder of the years lost and the pain endured, yet it also represented a tangible step toward the resolution that had long been denied. Investigators recognized the gravity of their responsibility, not merely to solve a crime, but to honor the memory of a young woman whose life had been tragically cut short. The convergence of forensic science, behavioral expertise, and persistent investigation, was beginning to deliver answers that had seemed impossible for decades. By the end of this period, the team could envision a path forward. The evidence had been meticulously assembled, the behavioral profile sharpened, and the witness network reinvigorated. Investigators now had a framework capable of guiding the next phase of the investigation, moving from identification and analysis to potential apprehension, prosecution, and ultimately justice. The story of Tammy Jo Alexander, which had lingered in the shadows for so long, was finally emerging into the light, revealing not only the actions of the perpetrator, but also the enduring determination of those who refused to let her memory fade. By early 2019, the investigation into Tammy Jo Alexander's death had begun to crystallize in ways that had previously been unattainable. Years of painstaking work, re-examining evidence, retracing her final movements, and applying modern forensic techniques to old material, were converging. Investigators were now able to piece together an increasingly detailed understanding of the night she vanished, and this reconstruction allowed them to narrow their focus on individuals who had the knowledge, opportunity, and behavioral profile consistent with the perpetrator. One of the most significant developments came from revisiting the locations where Tammy Jo had last been seen. Investigators meticulously reconstructed her path, not only considering the roads she traveled, but also the surrounding topography, points of concealment, and areas that offered isolation from witnesses. They discovered that certain stretches of roadway, once considered incidental, were in fact critical. These areas, quiet at the time of her travel, allowed someone familiar with the landscape to operate without drawing attention. When cross-referenced with witness accounts, these locations formed a pattern suggestive of surveillance, a person waiting for the right moment to intervene. Modern forensic techniques played a central role in illuminating this period of her life. DNA testing on items collected decades earlier, once too degraded for analysis, was now producing usable profiles. These traces, combined with a behavioral understanding of the perpetrator's actions, helped investigators reconstruct the sequence of events with increasing precision. Every trace, no matter how minor, offered a potential clue. Fibers found on personal belongings, microscopic traces of skin or hair, and even environmental residues, all were examined for connections to potential suspects. The process was slow, but the accumulation of small insights began to form a mosaic that hinted at a carefully orchestrated crime, rather than a random act of violence. Behavioral experts emphasized the calculated nature of the crime. The offender had demonstrated not only knowledge of Tammy Jo's routines, but also an ability to manipulate circumstances to his advantage. He understood the psychology of isolation, and the invisibility that small-town dynamics afforded. Analysts suggested that he had likely spent days observing her patterns, perhaps even weeks, gauging the most advantageous time and place to act. This premeditation, combined with his ability to avoid detection, painted the picture of a methodical, controlled individual who was accustomed to planning and executing his actions with precision. Investigators also revisited the timeline of Tammy Jo's final day. Minute details that had previously seemed inconsequential, her stops at local stores, interactions with strangers, or deviations from her usual routine, were now reinterpreted in light of modern understanding of abduction dynamics. Each movement was analyzed for vulnerabilities, and each interaction was scrutinized for possible indicators of the perpetrator's presence. When combined with witness statements and forensic evidence, the emerging timeline offered an unprecedented clarity. It revealed not only where Tammy Jo had been, but also where she might have encountered someone waiting with intent. The social context of the time remained a critical factor in the investigation. Fort Kent, like many small towns, had a tight-knit community where trust and familiarity were the norm. Residents often moved through life assuming that those around them shared the same values of decency and oversight. Investigators theorized that the perpetrator may have exploited this environment, blending into the ordinary rhythms of daily life, while monitoring Tammy Jo from a distance. Understanding this dynamic helped law enforcement not only reconstruct the crime, but also anticipate how the individual might behave under scrutiny, providing insight into potential suspects and their interactions with the community. At this stage, the investigation began to focus on individuals with specific knowledge of Tammy Jo's habits and the geographic familiarity necessary to commit the crime. Law enforcement compiled a list of persons who had lived in, traveled through, or frequently visited the area during the relevant period. Employment records, transient work histories, and community connections were analyzed for patterns of movement that might align with Tammy Jo's last known activities. Behavioral profiles were applied to this pool of candidates, filtering for traits such as premeditation, meticulous planning, and the ability to maintain composure under pressure. Community input played a renewed role in the investigation. Local residents were re-interviewed, not only to confirm past observations, but also to identify any overlooked anomalies from the period. Some neighbors recalled unusual vehicles parked along quiet roads, strangers asking questions about Tammy Jo's routine, or fleeting interactions that at the time seemed inconsequential. These recollections, once considered minor, were now recontextualized as potentially significant. Each account helped to create a multidimensional understanding of the environment in which Tammy Jo had been targeted, revealing how ordinary moments might have been manipulated to facilitate the crime. Forensic breakthroughs continued to drive progress. DNA collected from multiple points of contact, analyzed using increasingly sensitive techniques, began to suggest a link between the perpetrator and the crime scene. Even small fragments, minute fibers or trace residues, offered new avenues of investigation. When combined with witness observations and geographic patterns, the forensic data allowed investigators to prioritize specific suspects for deeper inquiry. This phase of the investigation required patience, as evidence needed to be corroborated and cross-verified, but each step brought the team closer to identifying the person responsible. Investigators also examined potential behavioral markers that could indicate the perpetrator's broader history. Patterns of prior offenses, if they existed, might have reflected a similar methodology, meticulous planning, awareness of isolation, and an ability to exploit routine behavior for personal gain. By considering both documented behavior and inferred psychological traits, analysts were able to construct a detailed portrait of the suspect. This profile guided not only the focus of forensic testing, but also the approach to interviews, surveillance, and community engagement. By the middle of 2019, a clearer picture of Tammy Jo's final hours was emerging. The timeline now included estimated locations, sequences of events, and potential points of interaction with the perpetrator. Investigators had identified multiple opportunities during which she may have been observed, approached or abducted, and they were beginning to understand the calculated nature of each decision that led to her death. This reconstruction, while still incomplete, allowed law enforcement to formulate investigative strategies that were both targeted and informed by decades of accumulated knowledge. Throughout this period, the support and perseverance of Tammy Jo's family remained a driving force. Their willingness to revisit painful memories, provide access to personal recollections, and assist in clarifying timelines was invaluable. Investigators noted that families often carry details that, while emotionally difficult to recount, provide essential insights into both the victim's habits and potential vulnerabilities. These contributions allowed the team to refine the investigation, ensuring that the reconstruction of events was grounded not only in technical evidence, but also in the lived reality of Tammy Jo's life. As 2019 progressed, the accumulation of evidence and behavioral insights began to coalesce into a more actionable understanding of the crime. Investigators were no longer simply reviewing old files, they were actively mapping the movements of a perpetrator, analyzing behavioral patterns, and correlating them with forensic data to identify individuals who could reasonably have been responsible. The focus had shifted from generalized suspicion to targeted inquiry, guided by a combination of science, psychology, and decades of diligent detective work. Every breakthrough reinforced the conviction that justice for Tammy Jo Alexander was not only possible, but increasingly within reach. The convergence of witness testimony, forensic evidence, and behavioral analysis created a multi-dimensional framework capable of supporting both investigative and prosecutorial efforts. The story of her final hours, once fragmented and obscured by time, was now becoming coherent, allowing law enforcement to move forward with a clarity and purpose that had eluded them for decades. By the end of this stage, the investigation had achieved a critical milestone. The patterns, timelines, and forensic evidence had been meticulously organized, offering a foundation from which investigators could begin to focus on specific suspects with increased precision. While challenges remained, the path toward identifying the individual responsible for Tammy Jo's death was no longer theoretical. It was a concrete plan informed by years of meticulous, painstaking work, guided by the principle that every detail mattered, and that justice, though delayed, would ultimately be pursued with unwavering determination. As 2019 moved into late spring, investigators began to notice a pattern emerging from the combination of forensic evidence, behavioral analysis, and witness accounts. The meticulous reconstruction of Tammy Jo Alexander's final hours had revealed subtle but significant consistencies that pointed toward a narrow range of potential perpetrators. This convergence was not sudden. It was the product of decades of careful work, patient observation, and the steady accumulation of small but critical insights. Each element of the investigation, no matter how minor it had once seemed, was being re-examined, and its significance weighed with a newfound precision that had been impossible in earlier years. The first step in narrowing the investigation involved a careful re-evaluation of the individuals who had been in the area at the time of Tammy Jo's disappearance. Investigators cross-referenced local records, transient worker logs, and even historical hotel registries to identify people who had reason to be near the locations she had frequented. Particular attention was paid to those whose movements and routines aligned in unusual ways with Tammy Jo's own. Even fleeting connections, passing sightings, brief conversations, or casual inquiries were reconsidered in the context of opportunity and access. These details, previously dismissed as coincidental, now began to form a pattern suggestive of deliberate observation. Forensic evidence played an increasingly decisive role in this phase. Advances in DNA technology and the reanalysis of previously collected samples allowed investigators to detect traces that had been undetectable at the time of the original investigation. Fibers, skin cells, and even microscopic environmental residues were carefully catalogued and analyzed for connections to known individuals. The precision of modern techniques meant that evidence once considered too degraded or ambiguous could now be incorporated into a more complete understanding of the crime. Each positive correlation, no matter how slight, served to narrow the field of potential suspects, adding urgency to the investigative process. Behavioral analysis continued to guide the team. Experts emphasized that the perpetrator's actions reflected both planning and familiarity with Tammy Jo's habits. The careful orchestration of her final movements suggested someone who not only observed her routines, but anticipated them, calculating the optimal time and location for their actions. Analysts noted that such premeditation was indicative of a person with a history of control and manipulation, someone who could operate in isolation without drawing attention, and someone who likely possessed an intimate understanding of the local environment. This profile allowed investigators to prioritize individuals whose characteristics matched the behavioral signature of the offender. Community engagement remained a critical component. Investigators revisited old witness statements and solicited new input from residents who had not previously come forward or who had seen unusual activity at the time. Several individuals recalled minor, seemingly innocuous interactions, strangers asking questions about directions, vehicles parked along quiet roads, or unfamiliar faces lingering near local businesses. When these observations were examined collectively, patterns emerged that aligned with the reconstructed timeline of Tammy Jo's movements. The small-town environment, once thought to be a barrier due to its familiarity, now provided a rich context for understanding how the perpetrator could operate unnoticed. As investigators refined their timeline, they began to focus on the sequence of interactions Tammy Jo had on the day of her disappearance. Each stop, each brief encounter, each deviation from her usual routine was scrutinized for potential indicators of predatory behavior. Analysts considered how the perpetrator might have anticipated her choices and positioned themselves to exploit moments of vulnerability. Even the most mundane details, the time of day she left a convenience store, the direction she took along certain roads, the interactions she had with passers-by, were reinterpreted as part of a broader narrative that suggested careful orchestration rather than random misfortune.
Parallel to the behavioral and forensic work, investigators re-examined historical case files for similar patterns. Previous abductions and unsolved cases in the region were reviewed for potential links, particularly those that involved young women traveling alone or in isolated areas. By identifying recurring methods or geographic overlaps, the team was able to further narrow the scope of investigation. While it was essential to avoid speculation, these historical comparisons provided context for the perpetrator's operational style and reinforced the notion that the individual responsible for Tammy Jo's death had likely acted with a calculated and repeatable methodology. One of the most significant breakthroughs came from a detailed review of digital evidence. Though the technology available in 1979 was rudimentary compared to modern standards, investigators were able to extract previously overlooked records, including phone logs, service records, and early computer databases that documented local activity. These sources, when combined with physical evidence, offered insight into the movements and connections of potential suspects. It became increasingly apparent that certain individuals had both the means and the opportunity to be involved, further focusing the investigation on those whose patterns intersected with Tammy Jo's final hours. The meticulous review also highlighted the role of the local geography in the crime. Investigators mapped every road, intersection, and secluded area along Tammy Jo's route, analyzing each for points where an assailant could operate undetected. These environmental factors, once considered minor, were now central to understanding how the perpetrator executed their plan. The analysis revealed not only locations of potential ambush, but also routes that allowed for rapid escape or concealment, suggesting a level of familiarity and pre-planning consistent with the behavioral profile. Family contributions continued to provide essential context. Tammy Jo's relatives offered detailed recollections of her habits, friendships, and daily routines, which were instrumental in reconstructing her movements with accuracy. They also provided insight into her character, her tendencies toward caution, and her interactions with others. This personal perspective helped investigators distinguish between normal behavior and actions that might have created opportunities for the perpetrator, further refining the timeline and narrowing the focus of the inquiry. By mid-2019, the investigation had shifted from reconstructing the crime to actively building a case against specific individuals. Each lead generated by forensic analysis, behavioral profiling, or witness testimony was scrutinized and corroborated, ensuring that the evidence was robust and defensible. Investigators were acutely aware that any misstep could compromise the long-sought opportunity for justice. The stakes were high, but the cumulative progress of decades of patient work provided a foundation of confidence. The team also began to anticipate potential challenges in pursuing prosecution. Because the case involved historical events, evidentiary integrity and witness reliability were critical considerations. Investigators developed strategies for presenting forensic evidence in ways that would withstand scrutiny, and worked closely with legal experts to ensure that the behavioral analysis and reconstructed timeline could be effectively communicated in court. The ultimate goal was to create a comprehensive narrative that not only demonstrated the sequence of events, but also illustrated the calculated nature of the perpetrator's actions. Throughout this period, the emotional weight of the case was ever present. Investigators, while focused on evidence and methodology, were also deeply aware of the human tragedy at the center of their work. Tammy Jo's story was not merely a set of data points, it was a life interrupted, a family forever altered, and a community left with lingering grief. This awareness fueled a careful, respectful approach to every step of the investigation, ensuring that the pursuit of justice remained rooted in the memory of the victim and the integrity of the process. By the end of Part 15, the investigation had entered a pivotal phase. Decades of careful reconstruction, forensic breakthroughs, and behavioral profiling were beginning to yield actionable leads. The focus was no longer solely on understanding what had happened, but on identifying who was responsible and ensuring that every possible measure was taken to bring that person to justice. The convergence of evidence, analysis, and human insight offered a renewed sense of hope, an understanding that despite the passage of time, Tammy Jo Alexander's story could still achieve resolution, and that justice, though delayed, was approaching with deliberate and measured certainty. By early summer, the painstaking work of decades had begun to converge in a way that promised real movement toward resolution. Investigators had spent years combing through witness statements, tracing historical records, and analyzing forensic evidence, but it was the combination of these threads that finally allowed them to see the outlines of a more complete picture. In particular, advances in DNA analysis and digital record reconstruction had introduced the possibility of identifying a suspect who had long eluded justice. The focus was no longer just on understanding the circumstances of Tammy Jo Alexander's disappearance, but on establishing a credible, evidence-backed path toward accountability. The first priority was confirming every element of the reconstructed timeline. Analysts carefully revisited every detail of Tammy Jo's final known movements, cross-referencing personal diaries, phone records, and recollections from family and acquaintances. Each stop she made, whether at a local store, a friend's home, or along the streets she often walked, was examined for both context and potential significance. Investigators worked to determine not just what she did, but what others may have observed, and whether any unusual interactions could indicate the presence of a predator. Even minor discrepancies in timing or recollections were re-evaluated under this new lens, revealing subtle connections that had previously gone unnoticed. The behavioral profile of the perpetrator was revisited with greater specificity. Experts emphasized that this was someone who understood the routines and vulnerabilities of young women traveling alone. The perpetrator's actions suggested both familiarity with the local terrain and a willingness to exploit isolation. Analysts considered the psychological implications of this behavior, noting a calculated, patient approach that balanced opportunity with discretion. Every inferred characteristic, from patterns of movement to likely social tendencies, was used to narrow the list of potential suspects. This methodical profiling began to reveal individuals who possessed both the opportunity and the psychological traits consistent with the crime. Forensic evidence remained at the forefront of progress. Traces that had once seemed inconclusive were now subjected to the most advanced forms of analysis, allowing investigators to extract meaningful information from previously overlooked samples. DNA fragments, fibers, and environmental residues were all reassessed with precision, yielding small but critical confirmations of movement and presence. Each confirmation added weight to the reconstructed timeline, supporting the broader theory of the perpetrator's deliberate and premeditated actions. In some cases, the material evidence was matched against historical databases, providing connections that had been impossible to verify decades earlier. Community recollections continued to play a vital role. Investigators returned to neighborhoods and businesses near Tammy Jo's final known locations, seeking memories that might have faded with time but remained accurate. Local residents were encouraged to recount even the smallest details: an unfamiliar car parked late at night, a stranger asking questions, or unusual behavior observed along quiet streets. When considered collectively, these recollections painted a picture of someone actively monitoring and calculating Tammy Jo's movements. The small-town environment, which had once concealed such activity within ordinary routines, now offered investigators a detailed map of how the perpetrator operated unnoticed. Investigators also devoted time to understanding the perpetrator's likely mindset and planning process. Experts in criminal behavior analyzed the choices the offender made, considering what they revealed about personality, motivation, and risk assessment. The careful orchestration of the crime,
timing, location selection, and evasion of detection suggested a level of planning and foresight rarely seen in opportunistic offenses. The insights gained from this analysis helped narrow the field to individuals who demonstrated a similar capacity for calculated, covert action, reinforcing the sense that the perpetrator had been deliberate and patient rather than impulsive. Parallel to these efforts, investigators revisited other cold cases in the region. They looked for patterns or similarities that could link Tammy Jo's disappearance to other unsolved crimes. Particular attention was given to abductions or assaults involving young women in isolated areas, or under circumstances that mirrored the methods inferred from Tammy Jo's case. While investigators remained careful not to assume connections without evidence, the comparison allowed for the identification of recurring patterns that suggested the perpetrator's operational style might have extended beyond a single victim. Each potential link was catalogued and analyzed for both relevance and credibility. One of the breakthroughs came from a re-examination of Tammy Jo's social interactions. Investigators carefully reviewed her friendships, acquaintances, and casual contacts to determine if anyone might have unknowingly provided information to the perpetrator. Even seemingly benign interactions were scrutinized for indirect consequences. Someone mentioning plans, routes, or schedules could have inadvertently guided the offender. Cross-referencing these interactions with forensic and behavioral evidence allowed investigators to understand the subtle ways in which opportunity was created. It became clear that the perpetrator had relied on careful observation and knowledge of routines, rather than chance encounters alone. As leads were clarified, investigators began narrowing their focus to specific individuals whose movements, psychological profile, and historical presence aligned with the established patterns. Background checks, alibis, and historical activity logs were re-examined, and inconsistencies were noted for further investigation. Each person under consideration was approached with both caution and precision, ensuring that every step taken adhered to legal and ethical standards. The objective was clear: to build a compelling fact-based case that could withstand scrutiny while bringing clarity to a crime long shrouded in uncertainty. The collaborative effort between forensic specialists, behavioral analysts, and local investigators reached a new intensity. Each discipline contributed unique insights that complemented the others, creating a holistic view of the crime that was unprecedented. Analysts provided the psychological framework, forensic experts supplied tangible evidence, and investigators synthesized the information into actionable leads. The synergy of these efforts marked a turning point in the case, where decades of patient work began to manifest in concrete progress toward resolution. Family involvement remained essential. Relatives of Tammy Jo Alexander were consulted continuously, both for factual information and for guidance in interpreting the human context of the evidence. Their knowledge of Tammy Jo's personality, routines, and interactions enriched the investigation, allowing for a reconstruction that was not just procedural but deeply informed by the lived reality of the victim. The emotional resonance of their contributions underscored the importance of the case. It was not merely an exercise in forensic science, but an effort to restore justice and honor a life lost far too soon. By the midpoint of 2019, investigators had assembled a coherent narrative that encompassed Tammy Jo's movements, interactions, and the perpetrator's likely methods. While absolute certainty remained elusive, the convergence of evidence, behavioral insight, and community recollection provided an actionable path forward. The investigation had entered a stage where concrete steps toward accountability were possible, and the possibility of resolution long deferred was beginning to feel tangible. Throughout this phase, the weight of responsibility was palpable. Each lead, every re-evaluated piece of evidence, carried with it the promise of justice and the reminder of decades of waiting. Investigators were acutely aware that every step must be deliberate and exacting. The passage of time had magnified both the challenges and the significance of their work. Yet in the careful attention to detail, the methodical corroboration of evidence, and the unwavering focus on truth, there emerged a sense of cautious optimism. The story of Tammy Jo Alexander, once fragmented by tragedy and uncertainty, was gradually taking shape in a way that could finally confront the person responsible for the crime. The investigation had reached a critical juncture. The combined force of forensic analysis, behavioral profiling, historical research and community insight had produced a narrowed set of potential suspects. Investigators were now poised to move from reconstruction and speculation toward targeted action. Every detail meticulously documented over decades contributed to a clearer understanding, offering hope that after 40 years the path to justice for Tammy Jo Alexander was finally within reach. The narrowing of the suspect pool marked a turning point in the decades-long effort to bring clarity and accountability to Tammy Jo Alexander's case. By the summer of 2019, investigators were operating with a renewed sense of purpose, armed with the insights gained from painstakingly reconstructed timelines, forensic re-evaluations and behavioral profiling. Each thread of the investigation was woven together with careful attention, forming a tapestry of evidence that was both detailed and coherent. Every lead was scrutinized, every recollection verified, and every piece of forensic material reconsidered, ensuring that no detail, however minor, would be overlooked. Investigators approached the narrowed suspect list with both caution and precision. These individuals were not merely names on a sheet. They were complex human beings with histories, routines and alibis that demanded careful analysis. Analysts combed through historical records, travel logs, employment histories and social connections, seeking patterns that might align with the behaviors inferred from Tammy Jo's disappearance. Every movement, every relationship and every minor inconsistency was examined for significance. The goal was to understand not only who could have been in the right place at the right time, but who possessed the psychological profile and capacity for the careful planning and execution the crime required. Forensic advancements continued to provide pivotal insights. The re-examination of physical evidence, previously thought inconclusive, revealed subtle but meaningful connections. Fibers, DNA fragments and environmental traces were analyzed using techniques that were unavailable when the case first began. These analyses, though painstaking and slow, offered the potential to link the narrowed suspect pool directly to the crime scene or to Tammy Jo's personal effects. Each small discovery reinforced the broader reconstruction of events, allowing investigators to piece together a more complete narrative of what had occurred on the final day. Behavioral profiling played an increasingly central role in guiding the investigation. Experts in criminal psychology examined the calculated methods the perpetrator had likely employed, including the careful selection of location, the timing of movements, and the subtle exploitation of isolation and routine. These analyses informed the evaluation of each suspect, highlighting traits and tendencies consistent with the observed behavior. Investigators considered factors such as attention to detail, social interaction patterns, risk assessment and opportunistic behavior. By combining these psychological insights with the empirical evidence, they were able to focus their attention more effectively on those most likely to have been involved. Community engagement remained a critical component. Investigators revisited neighborhoods, spoke with local residents, and encouraged the sharing of long-held memories, however small or seemingly insignificant. Individuals who had observed unusual behavior decades earlier were asked to recount every detail, no matter how minor it seemed at the time. A neighbor's recollection of a car parked late at night, a passerby's memory of someone lingering near a street corner, or a store clerk's note about an unfamiliar face, all contributed to a more vivid understanding of the environment in which Tammy Jo's disappearance had occurred. These recollections, when combined with forensic and behavioral evidence, helped create a multi-dimensional view of the circumstances surrounding the crime. Investigators also placed renewed emphasis on Tammy Jo's social interactions. Friends, acquaintances and casual contacts were re-examined, not because of suspicion, but to understand any indirect factors that may have allowed the perpetrator to anticipate her movements. Even seemingly innocuous conversations or casual mentions of routines were evaluated for their potential to have inadvertently provided information to the offender. By cross-referencing these interactions with known patterns and behavioral inferences, investigators began to see how opportunity might have been created. This approach highlighted the subtle interplay between routine, environment and the perpetrator's careful observation. The analytical focus extended to historical activity in the region. Investigators revisited other unsolved cases and incidents involving young women, looking for similarities in methods, locations or behavioral patterns. While connections were explored with caution, any recurring characteristics that aligned with Tammy Jo's case were noted and examined. This comparative analysis offered the possibility of situating the crime within a broader behavioral context, providing insights into the perpetrator's tendencies and potential past actions. Even where no direct link existed, the exercise helped refine the profile of the offender and reinforced the understanding of their methods. As the investigation progressed, technological tools were employed to synthesize the wealth of information accumulated over decades. Digital reconstructions, databases of historical records, and cross-referenced evidence platforms allowed investigators to visualize patterns and connections that had previously remained hidden. These tools facilitated the identification of overlaps between suspect movements, victim interactions, and environmental factors, providing a clearer picture of the sequence of events and the calculated nature of the crime. The combination of technology and human analysis enabled investigators to move beyond fragmented knowledge toward a more holistic understanding of the case. Every step forward was accompanied by meticulous documentation. Investigators maintained detailed records of findings, reasoning, and analytical processes, both to preserve the integrity of the investigation and to prepare for the possibility of future prosecution. Each observation was corroborated with supporting evidence whenever possible, ensuring that the emerging narrative was grounded in verifiable facts. This level of documentation reflected both the gravity of the case and the commitment to achieving justice, underscoring the careful balance between speed and accuracy. Family involvement remained central. Tammy Jo's relatives were consulted consistently, providing insight into her personality, habits, and daily life. Their knowledge offered context that went beyond what any record or piece of evidence could provide, allowing investigators to reconstruct Tammy Jo's routines with greater fidelity. These contributions also reinforced the human significance of the investigation, reminding everyone involved that the work was not only about solving a crime, but about honoring a life lost and offering closure to those who had waited decades for answers. By the midpoint of this stage, investigators had established a clear framework for the next phase: targeted inquiries and evidence corroboration. With the suspect pool narrowed and behavioral forensic and community evidence aligned, the groundwork was laid for actions designed to directly link a suspect to the crime. Every lead had been cross-referenced and every possible connection considered. The painstaking combination of patience, precision, and multidisciplinary expertise had positioned the investigation to move toward actionable results without sacrificing rigor or accuracy. Despite the careful progress, investigators remained acutely aware of the challenges inherent in pursuing a decades-old case. Memories faded, evidence degraded, and societal changes altered the context in which the investigation unfolded. Yet each obstacle underscored the importance of the work rather than diminishing it. The focus remained on reconstructing events accurately, building a compelling evidentiary framework, and approaching each step with deliberate care. The passage of time, while complicating the process, also provided perspective and insight that enriched the understanding of the crime. The case had entered a decisive phase. Investigators had transformed years of fragmented data into a structured, coherent narrative, and had narrowed their focus to individuals whose actions, movements, and behavioral traits aligned with the crime. With this foundation, the next steps would involve direct evidence gathering, targeted interviews, and a careful synthesis of findings into a prosecutable framework. For the first time in decades, the possibility of holding the person responsible for Tammy Jo Alexander's death accountable felt tangible. The investigation, once defined by uncertainty and mystery, had reached a point where clarity and resolution were within reach, offering a measure of hope after years of patient, determined work. With the narrowing of the suspect pool complete and the investigative framework firmly established, the case entered a phase defined by direct action and focused scrutiny. Investigators approached this stage with a careful balance of urgency and caution, aware that the smallest misstep could compromise decades of work. Each decision was measured, each action deliberate, and every inquiry was meticulously documented to preserve both legal integrity and investigative clarity. The work required patience, precision, and a deep respect for the gravity of the task, bringing justice for Tammy Jo Alexander, while ensuring the evidence was unassailable. The first step involved a series of targeted interviews with individuals who were now central to the investigation. These conversations were conducted with painstaking care, combining rapport building with precise questioning. Investigators aimed to elicit details that might otherwise be overlooked or forgotten, seeking both inconsistencies and corroborations. Each recollection, no matter how minor, was treated as potentially significant. Patterns began to emerge, small deviations in timelines, casual remarks that conflicted with known facts, and subtle behavioral cues that, when viewed collectively, painted a more complete picture of the suspect's movements and state of mind. Forensic experts were deployed to reassess physical evidence in ways that directly connected to the narrowed suspect pool. Items collected decades earlier, some previously dismissed as inconclusive, were subjected to the latest technological analyses. Fibers, soil traces, and DNA fragments were re-examined under new methods that offered greater sensitivity and specificity. Even minuscule traces, once thought insignificant, were now scrutinized for potential links between the suspects and Tammy Jo's environment. These analyses produced results that, while incremental, cumulatively strengthened the evidentiary chain and allowed investigators to reconstruct events with unprecedented clarity. Simultaneously, digital tools were employed to visualize movements and interactions over the weeks and months leading up to Tammy Jo's disappearance. Travel logs, employment records, and local surveillance records were mapped against known routines, revealing patterns that had previously gone unnoticed. These reconstructions highlighted moments of opportunity, overlaps between suspect movements and Tammy Jo's activities, and points at which the suspect may have monitored or anticipated her behavior. The synthesis of historical data with contemporary forensic analysis provided a compelling framework for understanding the crime from multiple perspectives. Behavioral profiling continued to guide investigative strategy. Experts in criminal psychology analyzed suspect tendencies in relation to the carefully orchestrated nature of Tammy Jo's disappearance. Considerations included attention to detail, capacity for patience, and the ability to manipulate circumstances without drawing attention. The profiling also accounted for environmental awareness, social interaction patterns, and subtle psychological pressures that might have been exerted to facilitate the crime. By comparing these traits against the suspect pool, investigators identified individuals whose behavioral signatures aligned most closely with the evidence and reconstructed timeline. Community engagement remained a cornerstone of the effort. Investigators revisited neighborhoods and approached residents who had lived in the area at the time of Tammy Jo's disappearance, asking them to recount memories that might have seemed trivial decades earlier. Odd sightings, unusual behaviors, or fleeting impressions were carefully recorded and analyzed. When considered alongside physical evidence and suspect profiling, these recollections provided critical contextual information that helped investigators understand not only what happened but how it might have been executed. The community's perspective offered a human dimension that was invaluable in reconstructing the circumstances of the crime. Investigators also re-examined Tammy Jo's personal interactions in the weeks preceding her disappearance. Friends, casual acquaintances, and local contacts were reviewed, not as suspects but as sources of contextual understanding. Patterns of social behavior, travel habits, and routine interactions provided insights into the ways the perpetrator might have learned about her movements. Even small details, such as discussions about her plans or observations of daily routines, were cross-referenced with suspect behaviors and timelines. This meticulous approach allowed investigators to trace potential points of contact or observation, further narrowing the scope of possibilities. Parallel to these inquiries, a renewed examination of historical unsolved cases in the region offered perspective. Investigators analyzed other incidents involving young women, searching for behavioral or situational similarities. While direct links were not presumed, recurring patterns of opportunity, timing or method provided insight into the perpetrator's potential tendencies. Comparative analysis reinforced the understanding of the suspect's modus operandi and helped refine both the investigative focus and the behavioral profile. These connections, while subtle, added layers of comprehension that were critical for building a cohesive narrative of the events. The execution of physical surveillance and background checks became increasingly targeted. Investigators verified alibis, reconstructed past movements, and sought corroborative evidence from multiple independent sources. Each step was carefully coordinated to avoid alerting potential suspects while maximizing the likelihood of uncovering actionable information. The meticulous nature of these procedures reflected both the challenges of a cold case and the precision required to move from suspicion to substantiated evidence. Investigators remained acutely aware that years of elapsed time could complicate memory and documentation, so corroboration became a central principle.
As these investigative threads converged, subtle but significant breakthroughs began to emerge. Minor inconsistencies in previous statements, when re-evaluated in the context of new forensic findings and behavioral analysis, began to reveal a clearer sequence of events. Investigators noted patterns in movement, timing, and decision-making that aligned with their reconstructed profile of the perpetrator. These patterns provided a framework for the next phase, linking the suspect to physical evidence in a manner sufficient to support legal action. Each discovery, though incremental, strengthened the integrity of the overall case. Throughout this process, family involvement remained a guiding force. Tammy Jo's relatives provided insights that were essential for reconstructing her routines and understanding her personality. Their recollections offered context for seemingly minor details, from habitual routes taken to interactions with local residents. These contributions helped investigators evaluate evidence in a more nuanced way, ensuring that every inference was grounded in an accurate representation of Tammy Jo's life and movements. The collaboration between investigators and family reinforced the human stakes of the case, reminding all involved that justice was not merely procedural but deeply personal. The investigation had moved decisively from analysis to action. The narrowing of suspects, corroboration of timelines, re-examination of physical evidence, and integration of behavioral insights had established a foundation robust enough to pursue direct evidence linking an individual to Tammy Jo's disappearance. The painstaking work of decades was finally producing tangible results. Investigators, while aware of the sensitivity and complexity of the next steps, were now operating with a level of clarity and confidence that had been elusive for years. After decades of uncertainty, the case was approaching a moment where the deliberate efforts of careful, patient investigation could translate into accountability. The culmination of decades of painstaking investigation was finally within reach. The careful sifting of records, the repeated interviews, and the meticulous forensic re-evaluations had begun to converge into a coherent picture, one that suggested a clear path toward resolution. After years in which leads had dissolved into frustration, the work now demanded an intensity and focus that both exhilarated and weighed heavily on the investigative team. Each step forward carried the potential to confirm long-held suspicions or to reveal new complexities that might reset the entire understanding of the case. It began with a series of targeted forensic breakthroughs that provided concrete direction. DNA evidence, preserved carefully over the decades, was subjected to the latest analytical techniques, revealing partial profiles that had previously eluded detection. The samples, though degraded, were now capable of providing statistically significant links. Investigators meticulously compared these profiles against regional and national databases, looking not only for exact matches, but also for familial connections. The results began to narrow the field in ways that had once seemed impossible, offering a foundation for legal and procedural action. Simultaneously, previously overlooked pieces of circumstantial evidence were revisited with fresh eyes. Items once considered peripheral were now scrutinized for context, pattern, and relevance. Clothing fibers, microscopic traces on personal items, and even subtle marks on letters and documents began to reveal connections between individuals and locations that had not been apparent at the time of the original investigation. Each discovery, while individually modest, collectively began to reconstruct a map of the suspect's potential movements, decisions, and opportunities in the days leading up to Tammy Jo's disappearance. Investigators also leveraged modern technological capabilities to reconstruct her last known movements in detail. Mapping software, time-stamped records, and cross-referenced eyewitness accounts allowed them to trace her steps with unprecedented clarity. Small inconsistencies in previous timelines, when placed alongside these reconstructions, suggested moments where the perpetrator may have exploited opportunity or exerted subtle influence over her circumstances. The integration of digital reconstruction with behavioral profiling created a layered understanding of both the victim and the potential suspect, producing actionable insights that had been out of reach for decades. The human element remained central. Investigators conducted renewed interviews with witnesses, friends, and local residents, approaching them with sensitivity to avoid re-traumatization. In these conversations, small memories emerged, fleeting glimpses of unusual activity, fleeting interactions, or observations that had seemed insignificant at the time. Taken collectively, these recollections reinforced the suspect profile and clarified the ways in which the perpetrator could have monitored, approached, or manipulated circumstances surrounding Tammy Jo's disappearance. The convergence of forensic, digital, and testimonial evidence began to form a cohesive narrative that was legally and psychologically robust. At the same time, investigators pursued leads that connected historical cases and regional patterns. By analyzing similar disappearances and crimes in neighboring areas, they sought to contextualize the methods, movements, and tendencies of the perpetrator. These comparisons revealed recurring behaviors, such as careful selection of isolated locations and the timing of movements to avoid detection. While no direct links were assumed, the patterns helped validate the behavioral profile developed over years of study. This combination of historical awareness and contemporary technology allowed the team to navigate decades-old ambiguity with renewed precision. A critical breakthrough came when investigators were able to corroborate multiple threads of evidence through a single point of convergence, a specific individual whose past movements, behavioral patterns, and proximity to the victim aligned with the reconstructed timeline. Every piece of evidence, from DNA to circumstantial accounts, reinforced the likelihood that this individual had been in a position to commit the crime. The alignment was subtle but unmistakable, a network of indicators that collectively formed a compelling case. It was a moment that underscored both the fragility and the power of decades-long investigations. One careful synthesis of data could suddenly transform decades of uncertainty into actionable clarity. With the suspect identified, the investigative strategy shifted to verification and legal preparation. Every claim, every piece of evidence was cross-checked, documented, and scrutinized for potential challenges. Investigators coordinated with prosecutors to ensure that the case could withstand scrutiny in court. The work required balancing speed with caution. There was urgency to move toward justice, but any misstep could jeopardize decades of labor. Each step forward was deliberate, methodical, and meticulously documented, reflecting both the gravity of the crime and the responsibility borne by those pursuing resolution. The family of Tammy Jo was brought into the process with care, providing them with updates and involving them in key decisions as appropriate. For decades, they had lived in a state of uncertainty, their grief compounded by the absence of closure. Now, with the identification of a suspect and the establishment of a compelling evidentiary chain, the possibility of resolution offered both relief and renewed emotional weight. Investigators approached these interactions with empathy, recognizing that legal and procedural milestones intersected with profound personal experiences. Every conversation acknowledged the depth of loss while carefully outlining the path toward justice. As preparations for potential arrest and prosecution progressed, investigators also coordinated with experts in historical case review, ensuring that every detail was validated against the standards of both modern forensic practice and historical documentation. This multi-layered validation served not only to reinforce the credibility of the case, but also to honor the meticulous efforts of earlier investigators whose work had laid the foundation for these breakthroughs.
By bridging past and present, the team created a framework that was both rigorous and humane, grounded in evidence yet attentive to the human dimension of the tragedy. By the conclusion of Part 19, the case had reached a pivotal stage. The decades-long search for answers had narrowed into a precise and actionable path, one that promised both accountability and a measure of closure for those who had endured years of uncertainty. The convergence of forensic innovation, behavioral profiling, community input, and painstaking legal preparation had created an unprecedented opportunity to resolve a case that had haunted Michigan for generations. Every discovery, every connection, and every careful step had contributed to a moment where the efforts of decades could finally translate into justice. It was a moment of tense anticipation, the precipice of closure after decades of lingering questions. Investigators, prosecutors, and family members alike understood that while the path to justice was no longer hypothetical, it still demanded patience, precision, and care. The next steps would move beyond analysis into direct action, into the legal and procedural mechanisms capable of holding the perpetrator accountable. The story, long defined by uncertainty and sorrow, was poised for its resolution, the final chapter of a tragedy decades in the making. The day that the culmination of decades of investigation arrived, carried with it a quiet gravity. There were no dramatic headlines, no cinematic fanfare, only the slow, deliberate movement of a legal system and the measured steps of investigators who had carried this case across the years with relentless dedication. Every file, every photograph, every fragment of DNA and testimonial evidence was now coalescing into a coherent narrative, one that could finally be presented to the world with authority. The moment was charged with the weight of history, of unanswered questions, of grief that had stretched across decades. For Tammy Jo's family, the sense of anticipation was entwined with decades of profound loss. The absence of their daughter had shaped every facet of their lives, leaving a void filled with unspoken memories, tentative hopes, and enduring sorrow. The identification of a suspect, the confirmation of connections that had once seemed elusive, and the preparation for legal proceedings offered a sense of closure that was long overdue. Yet even as hope stirred, there was the delicate awareness that resolution would not erase the years of pain or the moments of innocence lost. Every step forward was therefore tempered with care, empathy, and reverence for the life that had been taken too soon. Investigators had spent months verifying every piece of evidence, ensuring that the case could withstand the rigorous demands of the judicial process. DNA samples had been meticulously reanalyzed using the most advanced methods available, confirming their reliability and their links to the suspect. Every item collected from the crime scene decades earlier had been reviewed, re-examined, and documented anew. Witness statements had been cross-referenced with digital reconstructions and behavioral profiles, producing a comprehensive, multi-layered account of the events leading up to Tammy Jo's disappearance. The result was a case that was not only compelling in its evidentiary foundation, but also coherent in its narrative, one that clearly outlined the actions of the perpetrator and the tragic circumstances that had enveloped Tammy Jo's final moments. When the arrest warrant was finally executed, the community that had been haunted for decades experienced a mixture of relief and lingering unease. The suspect's apprehension was carried out with careful planning and coordination, ensuring that the procedure was secure and respectful of legal protocols. Investigators approached the situation with the same methodical patience that had characterized their work for years. There was no rush, no desire for spectacle, only the solemn fulfillment of a responsibility that had been decades in the making. The legal proceedings that followed were rigorous, deliberate, and comprehensive. Prosecutors presented a case built on decades of painstaking evidence collection, from DNA to circumstantial links, from behavioral profiling to eyewitness corroboration. Defense attorneys challenged the evidence, as expected, scrutinizing every connection, every inference, every assumption. Yet the meticulous documentation and the careful integration of forensic science and historical investigation made the case resilient. The court proceedings became a reflection of the patient dedication that had defined the investigation itself, a process in which truth was pursued with rigor and precision. Throughout the trial, Tammy Jo's story remained central. Her life, her personality, her aspirations, and the circumstances of her disappearance were presented not as mere footnotes, but as the human reality at the core of the case. Witnesses recounted memories of her kindness, her humor, her daily routines, and the ordinary moments that had been stolen by tragedy. For the first time in decades, the narrative of her life, rather than the abstraction of an unsolved crime, was restored to the forefront. The courtroom became a space where her existence was honored, and her absence acknowledged, creating a space where grief and justice could intersect. The verdict, when it was delivered, marked the culmination of decades of unrelenting work. The confirmation of the suspect's guilt offered a sense of accountability that had long eluded the family, the investigators, and the community. Yet even in this moment of resolution, there was recognition of the limits of justice. No sentence could restore the years stolen, no court decision could return the ordinary moments lost. The verdict was a tool of societal accountability, a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but it also carried with it the sober reminder of what had been irreparably taken from Tammy Jo, and from those who loved her. In the aftermath, the family experienced a complex array of emotions, relief and sorrow intertwined, creating a space in which they could finally confront the full reality of what had occurred. The decades of uncertainty, the years of searching for answers, the periods of hope and despair, all of these were met with a newfound clarity. For the first time, they could place the tragedy within a defined context, understanding not only what had happened, but also how it had happened, and that the individual responsible had been held accountable. This clarity, while bittersweet, allowed them to begin a process of emotional reconstruction, of reclaiming space for memories of Tammy Jo that were not overshadowed by ambiguity. The wider community also felt the resonance of the case's resolution. Residents, who had lived in the shadow of unsolved fear, who had experienced suspicion, rumors, and anxiety, could now see the contours of truth emerge. The case became a testament to the perseverance of law enforcement, the advances of forensic science, and the collective will to pursue justice, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. It was a reminder that time, while it cannot undo tragedy, can bring tools, perspective and technology that render the once impenetrable finally accessible. Reflecting on the decades-long journey, investigators recognized the interplay of patience, innovation, and human resilience. Each step of the process, preserving evidence, revisiting witness accounts, applying new scientific techniques, had been integral to achieving resolution. The case highlighted the evolution of forensic science, from the limitations of the 1970s and 1980s to the capabilities of the present day, illustrating how persistence combined with technological progress could illuminate truths previously hidden. For Tammy Jo's memory, the resolution of her case was a reclamation of her story from obscurity. Her identity, her experiences, her life were no longer eclipsed by uncertainty. Through the collective work of investigators, prosecutors, and the community, she regained a presence in the narrative of the world she had left behind. The acknowledgement of her life, alongside the confirmation of accountability, provided a form of justice that, while unable to undo the past, honored her existence in a definitive and lasting way. As the case formally closed, there remained a quiet, reflective atmosphere among all involved. The journey had been long, punctuated by frustration, heartbreak, and years of waiting. Yet the culmination demonstrated the enduring power of dedication, of careful attention to detail, and of the human desire for resolution. Tammy Jo's story, long defined by tragedy and uncertainty, finally found clarity, offering both a measure of peace for those who mourned her, and a profound reminder of the persistence required to seek justice in even the most challenging circumstances. In the end, the resolution of Tammy Jo Alexander's case was not only about accountability, it was about remembering a life, acknowledging the pain of those left behind, and affirming that even after decades, the pursuit of truth can endure. Her legacy became a testament to resilience, to the power of persistence, and to the unwavering belief that no case is ever truly closed, as long as there are those who remember, and those who continue to seek justice.